from lunch. I hope you had an enjoyable time eating, wherever that was. We're going to kick off our afternoon sessions now. So my name is Jacob Bilecki, and I work with the Area Agency on Aging. I'll be introducing our panel, but I'll also be moderating our panel today. So first, I would like to thank our track sponsor for the day. So Premier Mortgage Group has generously supported the conference this year, and they are the sponsor for all of the sessions on the Serving Older Consumers track. And I'd like to welcome Gabe Bodner from Premier Mortgage to just say a few words before we get started.
Sorry, I didn't need the front row. Somebody else got to film.
You're going back, you're going back.
All for being here today, and really want to thank again the opportunity to sponsor. Premier Mortgage Group has actually been in Boulder since 1991, and we are truly committed to the local community and to our local seniors. We offer all sorts of financing, from conventional FHA, VA, jumbo financing to reverse mortgage financing, which is what we are talking about outside here today. So if you'd like to get some more information on reverse mortgages, please come see our booth right outside the door. We're giving free money away, stacks of cash. If you haven't seen, there's some free cash outside. But in all reality, reverse mortgages have had a bad reputation, and I will say in some cases rightly so. But in the last 4 years, there's been some significant improvements and changes to the regulations, to the structure, to the fee structure, and to the amount of equity that seniors can access. They are becoming more and more accepted and talked about across the College of Financial Planning right now. And there's research that shows today that if a reverse mortgage is used strategically earlier in retirement, it can actually leave a larger legacy behind and improve somebody's tax situation. So if you'd like to learn more, please come see us. Again, right outside. Thank you for the opportunity to sponsor, and make it a great session.
Thank you, Gabe. So like I said, this session's going to operate a little differently. We're not going to have kind of formal presentations, but we're going to have more of a dialogue. We're very lucky to have Marissa Gerstein-Pinot here joining us before she flies back to Washington or somewhere else this afternoon. Okay. I'll introduce the presenters kind of formally, and then just kind of regroup our purpose for this dialogue, and then each panelist will kind of talk about who they are, what they do, where they're coming from, what they're up to, their perspectives, and then we'll kind of dive into some guided questions too. This is kind of an open session too with you all, so if you do have questions, I'll be kind of scanning, and feel free to join the dialogue, ask questions, the like. So without further ado, Marissa Gerstein-Pinot, if you weren't here for the morning, she's a researcher and senior associate with Frameworks Institute based in Washington, D.C., bridging research interpretation and applications units. Sociologist by training, Marissa has focused her research on gender and family, medicine, culture, and public policy. Prior to joining Frameworks, she served as a program officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, where she worked with panels of leading experts on a variety of topics. Marissa received her BA in Sociology from the New College of Florida and her MA and PhD in Sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles. Janine Vanderberg launched her Encore career in 2018. After 3 decades of leading Joining Vision in Action, the consulting firm she started in 1987 that has helped thousands of individuals and organizations involved in community and social change. Her new venture, Encore Roadmap, helps older adults develop social purpose businesses, advocates for age-friendly entrepreneurial policies, connects those entering the social sector with Encore mentors, and helps to change the narrative about older people and the economy. She is a certified Frameworks Institute master trainer in reframing aging. She's currently launching and directing Change the Narrative in Colorado, a statewide strategic communications campaign funded by Next 50 Initiative and the Rose Community Foundation to shift public perception about aging and ageism. And last but not least, Shunloi Fong is a director of communications for Cultivate, formerly Boulder County Care Connect. I don't know when we stop saying that, but we'll stop saying that soon, I think. A Boulder-based nonprofit that helps older adults flourish by connecting them as recipients and contributors with their surrounding communities. And he's also the founder of A Shared Humanity, a design studio and story incubator that helps individuals and organizations grow their impact through the power of shared human experiences with a diverse background in visual media, design, and tech. As Shunloi brings a passion for leveraging a diversity of tools, both online and offline, to build collaborations that contribute to a world as it ought to be. So, with that, I just want to kind of, now it's going to get a little messy. So,
Can't wait.
I just kind of wanted to initiate this by saying we'll be talking about the research end of things and the work that Frameworks is doing and how that's kind of entering into Colorado through the project that Janine is working on, but also bring in story and storytelling. And I think recently, within the last few years, storytelling as an idea and a practice has grown, gotten a lot more attention in the private sector as well as, I think, the public sector and nonprofits as another way to engage with audiences and effectively communicate. And that can be through, marketing a product to writing grants or advocating for public policies and public funding. And so to accommodate our diversity in the audience in terms of where you're coming from, be it advocacy, nonprofit work, public agencies, private organizations, or for-profit companies, we want to try to speak to all of those interests as much as we can, and certainly raise a hand or ask some questions where you might want to prod a little bit more or ask one of us to unpack something or dive into something. So that's kind of the idea. Hope it works. And so what we'll do is this first part is I'll kind of ask a question to each of our panelists. They'll spend some time talking a bit more in depth about who they are and what they do and their work. And then after we do that, we'll kind of open it up with some dialogue and some driving questions. So I'm going to sit down now. So my first question is, can everybody hear me? Okay. So my first question is for you, Marissa. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us more about how you see the Frameworks research and toolkits influencing communities across America? And what do you want organizations and companies to be aware of as the work of Frameworks expands and starts to percolate?
So I think probably in answering all the really amazing questions that came up after I presented earlier, I previewed some of what I would answer here. But I think to explain a little bit more about what Frameworks does generally is we get money usually from foundations to address a particular social problem. And so these are often big funders, so the Grant Makers in Aging is an example of that. We've also gotten money from the MacArthur Foundation, the Gates Foundation, et cetera, depending on what their particular focus is. And they're the ones who fund our research, which are 1.5 to 2 year processes, because we're all PhDs, which means we like to take some time to do our research. Compared to academics, though, we're like that. And then once we've done the research, we create various reports, toolkits, other things that advocates can go out and use to help create a new communication strategy. So we don't brand, we don't design websites, we create communication strategies that can be applied by the people who are really doing the work in the field. And as I think I mentioned earlier, we own our intellectual property. So Grant Makers in Aging funded the work that we did, but it's ours, and we do that on purpose because we want great frames to get into the hands of as many people as possible, because framing works best in high doses. So we want all of you to have access to the work that we did so that you can apply it into your communication strategies. So that generally lives on our website, but then we also do a lot of work like I'm doing today, where we come out and do presentations, do trainings, we do workshops, we do what we call frame checking, where people will send us their communications and we'll literally go line by line and help people reframe their communications. And another thing that we did with this project, which I think is really cool, is we trained people like Janine, who live in different parts of the country, because I work on a team of about 5 people, to create a whole group of really well-trained presenters who can do workshops, et cetera, and spread the frames all over the country. So we're actually this project is really lucky in that we managed to more than double our capacity to help people. So I think the result of that has been really positive, because we only finished this work about a year and a half ago, and we're already seeing the work being taken up all across the country, definitely here in Colorado. The state of Maine and also New Hampshire have really taken up this work, and there's sort of a regional campaign that's going on in New England right now on how to reframe aging and talk about aging in more positive ways. But we've done work in Florida. My colleague Jen spoke at the American Society on Aging not too long ago. So it's really, we have a really, I think, wide reach. And the beautiful thing about what we do, for me anyway, is because we work at the level of culture, we look at how our culture influences the way people think and talk about aging, and then find frames that work with that culture to create more understanding, better attitudes, more policy support. Our work has a really long shelf life, because culture is dynamic, but it's also very durable. Like, we add new ideas into our culture, but the ideas we had in the past didn't go away. They're still there. So that means that work that we did, in the past 3 years is going to continue to work to talk about aging in 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. The work that we did on early childhood development 20 years ago, we still are training people on a regular basis on how to use it. And so that's my hope for the aging work too, is that people continue to come to us and say, hey, I need some help with reframing. I'd love a presentation or a workshop, and we can still provide that way down the line. So does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay, great.
And just a follow-up, I guess. So how do you see, what kind of change do you want to see? And how would you measure that at the national level? I mean, obviously through things being picked up in certain states or certain institutions, deploying the toolkits, or signing on, or however you want to say it. But how would you see success in this work?
So so there's various ways to measure success, I think, short-term and long-term. A reframing process generally is a very long-term endeavor. As I said, we did that work on early child development 20 years ago. It's really seeped into the discourse. You see it a lot in media. You now see it in legislation in various places. The state of Tennessee has taken up our work and saved in times where budgets were being slashed, saved money for adverse childhood experiences and helping children in need using our frames, which was really exciting. So my hope is that this aging work is going to continue to kind of seep out into our general discourse, have the media and also organizations that care about aging and work on aging using the frames more and more and more, so people get those heavy doses, and that have those frames end up in policy, end up in programming, end up in people's budgets, end up in the mouths of policymakers and legislators. Like, that would be fantastic, in my opinion. And I think we're set up for that to potentially happen, as long as we have really great buy-in from a lot of groups. And right now, it seems like we're getting that buy-in. So.
Great. So Janine, can you share the work of Changing the Narrative Colorado? How did this work come about? What are you doing? What are you working on here in Colorado related to that project? What kinds of outcomes are you seeing, or what kind, how are individuals and groups and organizations picking up from it locally? Yeah.
That's a long question. There were other parts of it too, so I'm
There
prepared
are.
to answer all of it. Okay. So first, let me ask, I kind of want to find out who's in the room. Could you raise your hand if you're with a nonprofit? Okay. Government? For-profit? Hybrid, social enterprise, B Corps? Okay. Policy advocacy groups? Okay. Thank you. Finding you after. Okay, great. And so one of the reasons I'm asking that is we've found, and I think when we started the initiative in 2018, and then I'll go backwards and answer some of your questions, we thought that most of the workshops that we would be doing were strictly with this category called aging advocates. And we soon realized that framing and how messaging about older people and about ageism, it turns up in so many places. So it turns up in policy advocacy shops that might say, because they want a policy advance, use the term silver tsunami, and you might have heard from Marissa this morning why that's a terrible idea. So we've really thought more expansively beyond what one might simply consider, quote, an aging advocate. So it's always helpful for me to find out who's in the room. So Changing the Narrative is basically a strategic communications and awareness campaign. We have this really big goal that we want to do, and so we agree it'll take a long time. We literally, and it's in our tagline, we want to end ageism in Colorado together. We want to do it with a lot of people. How it came about, so there's been a lot of work going on in Colorado, and probably many of you have been a part of it, kind of about how we changed thinking about older adults and viewing them as assets instead of deficits. Rose Community Foundation, who's one of the major funders of this initiative, along with Next 50, very prominent in this work for over a decade in Colorado, advancing the work based on encore.org, but that older adults can be an incredible asset to our community. So there's been a lot of funding and interest in that area. I think Social Venture Partners in Boulder, for example, has Encore Fellow and that kind of thing. So a lot of interest in that. Rose Community Foundation, so the tie to the frameworks work is Rose Community Foundation was also one of the original funders who, with the leading aging organizations that you probably heard about in Marissa's presentation this morning, was funding Frameworks Institute work. So about 2 years ago, Rose approached the company that I then headed and said, we'd like you to help us think through what an initiative to change narrative and to reframe aging in Colorado might look like. We started kind of developing a logic model, some ideas. Therese Ellery, Senior Program Officer at Rose, sent me to the Frameworks Institute in training in DC just a little over a year ago. So I became a certified master trainer, and before I know it, in December, Rose Community Foundation had funded their portion of the initiative. Next 50 came in a little bit later. So in January, I found myself leaving the firm that I headed and leading this thing called Changing the Narrative. So what do we do? Part of it, and a big part of what we do, are reframing aging workshops. So the kind of things that Marissa talked about, they are the frameworks workshops on the new messaging, the frames, culture change, and all of that. We do 3-hour workshops, we do full-day workshops. We do them across the state. So this is my commercial plug. If you are interested in having a workshop kind of in your community, let me know. And because we are scheduling 2019 right now, and I know some of you in the room have already been to some of our workshops. So that's part of what we do. But we also knew that the training workshops were not going to be sufficient for the amount of culture change that we wanted. And we also knew that there were other narratives that we wanted to change. So another narrative that we wanted to change was this idea that people have that older workers are not valuable. And this idea that even older workers themselves sometimes have, that we should get out of the way for younger people. So we know that there have been 4 major studies that show that actually the economy overall and younger workers are better off when older workers stay in the workforce. So we ended up putting together kind of the business case for age-friendly multi-generational workforces. Those of you who are in the front rows have copies of these, but there are additional copies on the front rows if you want to take one. And so part of what we're doing are also presentations to businesses, to HR people, on the business case for age-friendly and multi-generational workforces. Another thing that we realized initially when we were doing some of the frameworks presentations, there were members of the general public in the audience who said, well, I'm not in a position where I am reframing the language of my organization, but I really want to talk to people I know about ageism. So we've recruited a group of people called change agents, and they're basically volunteers, and they do basically house parties. And they go, and within their own networks and circles, they do kind of like presentations and facilitated discussions on how do we talk about ageism and what are things that we can do to get rid of ageism and that kind of thing. We're also doing a social media campaign. We're doing earned media and that kind of thing. What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? I actually pasted them in from our logic model. We are trying to increase understanding of aging and ageism by those participating in our work. We want to see, over time, increased use of messaging with the research-based frames. We want to see that diffusion that Marissa talked about. We're hoping that we want to see improved attitudes and beliefs about age-friendly funding solutions and policies. We want to see reduced use of negative and destructive stereotypes about older people, kind of like that horrific political ad that I think Marissa showed in her, that we actually launched somewhat of a campaign, and we got people to go to Nail Communications and post on their Facebook, and we got some of the leading aging organizations we were working with to write letters, and we want to see change policies and practices. How are we doing so far? So we just started in January, but since that time we have done 35 of the frameworks reframing aging workshops across the state, have reached over 1,200 people so far, and we have 12 more workshops scheduled before the end of the year. After every workshop, we do a workshop evaluation, so we know now about 88% say that they will use the recommendations, 92% agree it increased their knowledge of ageism, 94% that they understand now what makes for effective messages, and most important to me is that over 90% of people who participate in our workshops say they intend to do something to address it and they intend to use the frame. So we have a process of follow-up evaluation, and we'll see what actual use is, and we're trying to find out what barriers are. But that's kind of what we've been doing so far.
It's a ton of work.
I'm tired.
Very ambitious.
Yeah. It's great. It's fun. No, it's fun.
So, so that's kind of the frameworks part of the introduction,
Right.
and Shunloi is going to talk about more on the communication side and storytelling, and with a disclaimer that Shunloi is not a frameworks disciple. I don't know what the word would be, but
will be at the
I
end.
will be at the end of this
We're
one.
groupies. Yeah.
So
Wish I had my
really
little
our
frameworks
purpose
pen.
here is
You
to
need pens.
to understand a little bit more about what's happening in the frameworks work and what's happening in Colorado, and for Shunloi to talk a little bit more about his experience from a communications and storytelling background, and also kind of a rebranding experience as well. And then our dialogue will really kind of try to fuse the two and talk about both elements.
Well, I'm going to jump up here because I have, for those of you that are visual, I put some of the things I'll just share with you onto the slide so you can at least see. When it comes to speaking, though, I'm terrible at multitasking. So if I'm still on the first slide when I'm done, there's a reason for that. But I'll try to remember to bring them down or to go from slide to slide. I told Jacob yesterday there's so much to talk about with storytelling, and I'd love nothing more than to have 2 days with you guys, to walk through the process of the role that story can play in each of your organizations, as well as developing kind of the conceptual framework as well as the strategic framework for really infusing story into every aspect of your organization. But I have 10 minutes, and so I'm just going to, in these 10 minutes, just share with you a little bit about my beginnings of an approach to storytelling as it might play out for different organizations. Here's where I'd start as kind of a baseline posture or attitude that I take with storytelling. We live in a world where people crave they crave authentic connection, right? They crave meaningful experiences with other people. They crave a sense of belonging in a community. And because of that, in the world in which we live, right, there's so much content, there's so many stories, there's so much noise that all of us here in this room, we actually have amazing opportunities to really move beyond the status quo of storytelling and communications and really embracing story in a way that connects with real human beings. Right? We have the opportunity to create authentic relationships with people that move beyond demographics or data points or metrics or things like that. See, I've already forgotten to move on. Here we go. So we have that opportunity to engage story in that way. When we take kind of a holistic perspective about the role that story can play in our organizations, we have amazing opportunity to really grow our brands, but even more importantly, to grow our impact in the community. So that's like my kind of posture, understanding kind of some of those deep desires that just as human beings that we have, and embracing story in a way that begins to meet those needs. But what I want to do is take a step back, okay? Because is that coming from me? Loud.
Turn it off and turn it on again.
I can speak loud. Can you all hear me? If I speak really loudly? All right. Hello? Testing. Are you out there? I'm going to turn this off. Okay,
Yeah, turn it off.
All right. So I want to take a step back regarding, talk a little bit about what I mean when I'm talking about story. Because story is, as Jacob was talking about, like it's gotten more attention. It's kind of become a buzzword. And it's become a buzzword for a reason, because we're wired for story. Like story is core to who we are. So all of a sudden it became really popular. But my guess is a lot of us in this room, and no judgment, like I would be the same way not too long ago, that we might not even be able to identify or explain like what makes a compelling story, right? What are the components of a story? Is this working? Is it? Or is it just a prop here? Okay, so what I want to do is just so that we're kind of having a shared understanding of what I'm talking about with story. On a very basic level, the structure of story is you identify a problem, you identify a solution to that problem, and then there's a resolution, that when someone engages that solution, they experience some sort of resolution. That's story on a very, very basic level. But that plays out very practically in your organizations. It might be in your web copy, it might be in the emails that you send out, it might be when you meet someone at a conference, it might be the way you answer your phone, your advertising. Like you can infuse story into all of the things that you communicate. Okay, so that's a very basic definition. Now, if we expand that a little bit, if you look at like Hollywood, is this thing like really jumping in and out?
Sounds like it.
Yeah. Just talk really loud.
I'm just going to talk loud. We're going to call it. You know, if you look at some of the famous movies out there, right, like Star Wars or Harry Potter, back in the day, right, like, they all share a similar structure to their story, and that is that every great story has a hero. Right? The hero wants something, but they have a problem that's preventing them from getting what they want, and sometimes that problem is I feel like I'm the one that's causing it. So I just like walk around the room.
We're all starting to think that.
Oh, maybe it's the phone.
It might be the phone.
Yeah.
Testing 1, 2.
All right.
Keep
I'm
going.
just going to keep going. All right. I feel like
Stand further and further away.
I'm a walker anyway, so this is kind of fun. Maybe I'll look down.
There's a good story emerging here, Shasta.
You're going to tell it.
Yeah, I am.
So, a hero wants something, but they have a problem that they can't overcome. And it hero they are, right? You need to be a guide to them, but if you don't know their problems, then you can't tell stories that help them solve their problems, right? So you have to spend time with them to understand how best to engage them with story. And the third practice is when you know yourself and you understand your audience, you can bring those pieces together and share together. Now, if I get up and I tell you a story, it could be a really great story, and it could be very moving and inspiring, whatever it might be. But if we all go out for drinks after this and we're sharing our stories with each other, that's a much more powerful collective story that we're building together. So when you understand yourself and you understand your audience and you bring those together and share life together, share experiences and stories together, you build a more powerful collective story. Okay, so that is like the conceptual framework, and when you figure that out, some of those pieces, then it helps you then to figure out, like, well, okay, strategically, what should we do? Okay, right? And you can build your strategic framework for how you tell stories. Okay, a few notes that I want to make, and then I want to finish up. Number one is you got to experiment a lot. You got to take risks. You have to fail. If you don't have some failed stories, you're not pushing hard enough, because there are so many ways to tell stories, to facilitate stories. You got to try different things. But don't do it just to do it. You need to understand, how do I know if this is successful or not, right? So you need to understand your data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. You need to know, like, this was successful, this resonated with our community, let's continue with that or not, right? But you got to experiment a lot, try different things. The second thing is give value. Always give more value than you ask. And this is part of the problem when organizations make themselves the hero, is that all of a sudden they're the hero with a problem and they need help with something. We need your money. We need you as a volunteer. We need you to give us your knowledge or your resources. But when you realize that they're the hero and that you're the mentor, that you can come alongside them, you can give them more value. And the beautiful thing is when you do that, you become the hero to them. And you have this collective shared story. So when you ask for something, give money, buy this product, whatever it might be, they're going to be much more invested and willing to give back because you gave them value in the first place. The third thing is create ways for your community to participate, right? If you take the time to listen to them, you start building relationships with them, you understand their needs, right? You can trust them to participate and contribute, which makes life a lot easier. If you're responsible for telling your organization stories, right? If you have to tell 100 stories, that's really hard on your own, but if you can bring your whole community in to help contribute to those 100 stories, it makes life a lot easier. The fourth piece is what is called an omni-channel approach or multi-channel approach, and it's kind of a marketing speak, but basically what it means is as you build your stories, do it in a way that can be repurposed across multiple channels, right? Don't just create a video, it goes on YouTube, and it can never be used anywhere else. You want to think about how your stories go across your different channels, so that way, no matter what touch point people come to you at, they're having the same cohesive experience and engaging the same story. So that's something to think about on a strategic level as you create your stories. Okay, to finish up, if nothing else, right, facilitate the living out, I'll read it, of stories that create authentic connections, meaningful experiences, and greater sense of belonging. Right, it's going to help you better serve your community, make a greater impact, and grow your brand. Right? And the collective story that you all live together is going to be way more powerful and rewarding and transformative than if you're just getting up and kind of telling a story. So my last point, and then I'll quit here, is I actually don't agree with the title of this panel. Like, let's not tell our story. Let's live our story. Let's facilitate stories, because that's going to be way more powerful in bringing the community together. So.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Hello? Yes? All right. Okay. Cool. So now now we're going to fuse. So
this is where it gets messy.
This is where it gets even messier, maybe.
Right.
So you know, we've got practitioner, we've got researcher, and we've got kind of in between fuser, right? So where, you know, I was thinking when Chinloy was talking, like from a nonprofit space, it's like we have a client, we tell the story, or we talk about that client, right? And in some cases, it might just be we have a program, or a service, or a product in some cases, and we say client X did this and this was achieved, or to some effect, you know, that's kind of the basic ingredients of a story. So how, if an organization that has, an approach to storytelling which is pretty straightforward, and in some cases the intention is maybe just to promote and advertise through a client's experience, how might an organization be more intentional in those communications? So what should a communicator, and it could be somebody testifying in front of a city council, or it could be somebody running an ad in a newspaper or online, or even a Facebook post or whatever. How do you suggest an organization or a person in that role approach that process? And considering what you've said, and also the work of frameworks, and trying to really activate the research and activate what suggestions you're offering. That's an open question.
Can I add a question?
Yeah.
So it's
Sure.
kind of the same thing, but I think if we make it more specific, it might. So here's what happens. Every time I do a workshop and I say, do not tell the story of sad senior, poor Emma who got evicted because of gentrification in Boulder and her belongings are now on the sidewalk. People are like, okay. Then they go back and they say, I talked to my grant writer, she says you're crazy. So, so if I can cue it up that way to you, Marissa, because I really want to know your answer.
Sure. So I think the work that we do is a little bit different because we're not telling stories about, well, we do tell stories about our organization, everybody does, but our focus is on telling stories for social change. And the basis of our theory of change is that if people understand social problems better, then it's going to lead to social change. So we do think about storytelling a little bit differently because we think about how do we tell a story that can create that social change. So as I said, actually, you missed it, but this morning somebody asked a question about kind of individuals. And we do have fairly strong feelings about individual stories, and I would never say don't tell an individual story. Individual stories are powerful, definitely. The problem is when you only tell an individual story, you are leading people to think about that individual, their individual problems, and the individual solutions to solve their problems. So I'm just going to give an example of some work that we found that kind of inspired some of what we were doing, which was a short documentary about a woman who was living on her own. I don't remember what city she was in now. I don't know if you've seen this, Janine, but she was very isolated. She couldn't see well. There was no transportation around her to take her to a senior center or anything. Her children were very busy. They couldn't visit her very often. So what did she do? She hung out in her home and she took mail and she shredded it. And that's what kept her hands busy, and it's what kept her going day after day, was shredding mail. So her apartment had all this shredded mail. And I don't recall now if this was an advertisement. It might have just been a short documentary. But people's response when they saw it, well, what do you think their response was when they saw it? How sad, and what was the solution they came up with? They sent her more mail. So, that narrow focus on an individual that didn't have that wide angle lens, which didn't explain the reason why this person is isolated is not because they have crappy children or their health is deteriorating, but it's because they don't have access to services, transportation, senior centers, health services. Their children don't have support for caregiving that would make their lives better. And if people knew that, they would then think about solutions that were solutions like better transportation, better health care centers, better senior centers, right? So we actually, in our work that we did on elder abuse and neglect, we actually tested a story that worked out really well where we took kind of an encapsulated version of that, but surrounded it with the frames I presented earlier. So it started with talking about how we're innovative people, or actually this one used social justice. We found that worked really well for elder abuse. In a just society, we would take care of the people who are aging in our society. this is the reason that elder abuse and neglect happens is because we lack social supports and we need all these different supports. Here's an example of a person who, because that things aren't working the way they need to work, is facing a lot of difficulty. Here are the solutions that we know work. So that's just a different way of telling stories than that sort of super pointed, let's tug the heartstrings. Right. And we talked about this a little on our call a few weeks ago too. Every communication you put out, whether it's for fundraising, whether it's to bigger funders, whether it's to people who are part of your organization, are always an opportunity to increase people's understanding. So even if, okay, fundraising is going to work a little better if we tell that heart-tugging story, that doesn't mean you can't surround it by that context and hope that people understand, okay, what we need are social supports, and these are the specific supports that would help that individual person and everybody. So I would just encourage you to always think about, when you're crafting any communication, how can we increase people's understanding and then increase their support for the things that all of us know are really effective at helping us live well.
And so one of the things that we've learned in our first 10 months of doing workshops with nonprofits and government is that a lot of people are struggling with how to do that. So one of the things, and we're about completing, and then they'll be available on our website for people who have taken our workshops, is we put together basically a series of fundraising and grant proposal templates that reframe a lot of, so whether you're providing you're involved in housing or support services, home delivered meals, or different categories of workforce that help you reframe. So as I think I had this recognition, the people on our team had this recognition, we could ask 1,200 people to all figure this out themselves, or we could kind of create a series of things that surround the frame. So anyway, look to our website, and it's on, I think it's somewhere on here, I hope. Our designer put our website on there, but we're trying to create some tools that will make it easier for everybody to take the frames, apply it to their own work, so you can move away from the individual story to those stories that widen the lens and show more what the social issues are that are at play.
I don't remember the original question, but I think the...
But it was a good one.
But it was a great one, yeah. Okay. I think the example is a great one about, this very detailed story of this lady, and I think part of the problem with telling, there's a number of problems with telling the story that way. It's certainly kind of on just that very negative perspective and leaving it at that. I think part of the problem also is what I talked about, where you're making this lady in the story the hero, and the person who's reading the story, they don't experience the same external problem that she's experiencing. So they can't even see themselves in that story. Whereas when you dig deeper, you take the time to find what's the real problem that this lady's facing. Not that the external problem isn't a real problem, it is, but what's the deeper internal problem that's very human? Then when your listener engages that story, they can begin to see themselves in that story. And so I think that's an important aspect of it, is really understanding what problem are we trying to address here in this story. But I really agree also with the kind of that aspect of it. If someone tells this story and they just focus in on this lady and her details and her problems and things like that, I would just say that's a really bad story. A good story, like you also need to zoom out a little bit and have that wide lens to really understand the full context of the story. I'll use Star Wars as an example again, right? Like if you started that movie and all you saw were like all the little details of his life, before he discovered his story and history, and then he started moving on from there, but you didn't understand the broader perspective of what was going on in the empire and the rebellion and all these different factors that played in, like it just wouldn't be as good of a story. And so I do think it's important to, and not just for the sake of a good story, mind you, like even to accomplish some of these different objectives. We might have different objectives for our stories, and we have to figure that out. But kind of just in a theoretical standpoint, like zooming out and understanding that wider lens, whether it's for the purposes that you're talking about or other purposes, it's really important to have both. Like the individual stories are good, but you got to understand the bigger picture as well. Yeah. So.
So I've got like 5 ideas in my head, so I just have to process that for a second. So it requires to even put energy into thinking about this, right? I have one question around why, like, in what's the case, sort of, in terms of organizations, and I know there's an advocacy social change element to it, but I want to go a little further into some of your experience, Janine. Why are people coming to you? Why have you already met with 1,200? You said 1,200.
I don't know. So we really thought, yeah.
And then
Yeah.
you know, because it takes interest and it takes agency to get there and to do it, and then it takes a lot of proactivity when to intentionally message and to put more and to realize the impact and value of whenever we're messaging, however we're messaging, you know.
Right. So I think that there are a couple of reasons. We literally thought, we started in January, and we thought, if we do, I don't know, 10 to 20 presentations and workshops by the end of 2018, you know, that's going to be so great. And we're inundated, so we need another trainer in Colorado. Why people are coming. So I think, and this is not news to all of you, we know that funding for programs serving older people has shrunk at the same time. Population is dramatically increasing. We know that policy changes, and I think a lot of you working in community understand that policy changes are needed. So we've had people from who are starting age-friendly communities come to our workshops because they want kind of policies on municipal, on a regional, on a statewide level, and they want to see those change, and they recognize that the stories that they're telling aren't working. What we know, and what I love about the framework, metaphors, and values way of messaging, and the fact that it really emphasizes focusing on solutions, is that it works, and it's been tested to work. So I think as people realize, if we talk collectively in a different way, we might be able to influence funding decisions, we might be able to influence policy decisions. That would be a great thing. I want to talk about somewhat of a little bit of a policy win that we've already had. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging. Are any of you members of it here? SAPCA members. So we presented our business case to the Workforce Development Committee, and in the recommendations that they are making to the state of Colorado next week, there are going to be some of our recommendations, because again, we're positioning, we've got this potential in Colorado, we've got this increased longevity, it's a potential asset to community, but we need policies that can help older people stay in the workforce, retrain older people and that kind of thing, and those kind of policies are already. So I think people are ready for it, and certainly, I mean, look at all of you here. It's, you realize that the stories that we're telling don't work, and they especially don't work when we are, what is it that funders say? Funders call, oh yeah, it's a cost to invest in older people programs, but it's an investment to fund programs for young children. I am totally and have always been in support of early childhood, but we need to think differently about how do we support age-friendly communities throughout the lifespan. So I think that's to me why people are coming. And but we also recognize that we need to talk to funders, so we have done presentation to the Aging Dialogue Group in Colorado, which is a group of funders. I was at Grantmakers in Aging 2 weeks ago, presenting on our work to let funders know this is how the frameworks research, which they're familiar with, actually works on the ground. Here's what you need to know. So, but again, and you heard about from Marissa this morning about the importance of movement building. If we all start talking in the same direction, I think we're going to have better outcomes, both in terms of policies that we need and in funding support for programs that we operate.
Organizational change is required in some cases, right? So, and especially, I've been in one of your workshops, and I've seen things manifest a little bit too. Like, you bring in a brochure or a flyer into a workshop, and you know, identifying areas where some improvements could be made. So around that organizational change, I guess one question for you and then one question for you, Shinloy. Like, what are you seeing organizations, what kind of change are you seeing? And then Shinloy, I'd be curious to hear about your experience just in terms of rebranding, working with a nonprofit as it went through a rebranding experience in 2018, and why that happened and what that's looked like and what came out of that. So
So a big part of this is organizational change, and Margaret Frankhauser, who's the CEO of Next 50 Initiative, said at the outset, you know, Janine, this is going to be a big organizational change. And I was like, I've been a change management consultant for 30 years, so. And this has been about organizational change. So this idea, it's a little kind of swear jar, but with the word senior on it. One organization that was working with us, and their recommendation, they wanted to use older adult and older person instead of senior, and they had a lot of people who were really resisting that. So they kind of created this little swear jar. So if people use the word senior, they have to put $1 in the swear jar. The point of that is more that people are starting to recognize that it is not just the people who are coming to the workshop, that there are people throughout their organization that need to think differently, write differently, talk differently about aging and ageism and the people they serve. So so we've been helping people individually with that, but one of the things we're going to be doing in 2019 is literally after you take a reframing aging workshop, you can take other workshops on how do you drive deep this change within your organization. How do you get other people involved? We'll go out and we're going to spend more time helping people actually work with their teams, work with their boards, so they don't get the reaction of somebody coming to the workshop and being highly enthusiastic and then coming up against a board member who's like, well, there's no way we're doing that. So that's kind of some of the things that we're planning to do.
To answer the question about rebranding, yeah, so Cultivate went through a rename and rebrand process in 2017 and 18. We launched it in the middle of May. Just to give you a little bit of history about how that came about. When I came on staff in early 2017, part of it was with the idea of helping the organization walk through this rebrand process. And one thing that I discovered was that we were called Boulder County Care Connect, and we had a really strong sense of what we did. Right? We provide grocery delivery services, medical rides, yard cleaning, snow removal, and basic fixes in people's homes. And that's what we did, and those are really good things. But what I discovered is that we didn't necessarily have a stronger or deeper sense of our why. Why do we exist? Not just what we do. Why do we exist? That no matter what we do, it grows out of that why. And so that was part of the process was, it's not that people in the organization didn't necessarily know that, it had just never been formalized as a team. And as we dug into that, discovering that the name, it had some practical challenges, but it also had some deeper philosophical challenges for us. So that was kind of what kickstarted some of those elements of rebranding. Maybe I'll just make a couple comments about, if you're considering rebranding or building your brand, right? Again, that's kind of a buzzword. We talk about it, like what does that really mean? So here's a few thoughts on it. Number one thing to remember is that your brand is not what you say it is. No one cares what you say it is. Your brand is what everyone else says it is, right? You can say we're like, we're a really friendly, approachable brand. And when you pick up the phone and you answer them, you're like, what do you want, right? Like, okay, that doesn't jive, right? So the person listening to the phone on the other side of the phone is like, that's not your brand, right? So your brand is defined by the people in your community that engage you. So that's one thing. That doesn't mean you can't influence your brand, but you can't dictate your brand. A second thing that I'll point out is that your brand is really the sum total of every experience or touch point that your audience has with you, right? So you can tell these amazing stories, but if people call you and they have a bad experience on the phone, that just diminished your brand, right? And so all those pieces contribute to your brand. So when I talk about story, like that's why I talk about infusing every aspect of your organization with story, because every touch point is story and it influences your brand. If you have 100 people in your organization, your communications department has 100 people in it. Right? If you have 50 people in your organization, your communications department is 50 people. I have the easy job, actually. I'm oftentimes just sitting in the office doing a lot of the behind the scenes strategy, things like that. Like, it's our people who are out in the field, on the phone, like they're the ones who are doing like the real communication with people. Right? So everyone plays a role at every touch point in either strengthening or diminishing a brand. So that's another thing to remember. A third point that I'll make is your brand is more than your name or your logo. In fact, your name and your logo is like a really small part of it. if you have if people love your name and love your logo, it's not because they love the name and the logo, it's because they've had good experiences with your organization. When we rebranded, we had, I was actually amazed. A lot of people loved our name, and I was surprised by that. I thought, usually there's more kind of pushback with change. So I thought there would be, or maybe I just didn't hear from them. But I did hear from some people who were very vocal about, I hate your name. There's still time to change it. It's ridiculous. I heard all these things. And I had great conversations with them where I said, you know what, I love the fact that you hate our name and that you were honest about it. Because I know our name is not going to resonate with everyone. But what I love is that you actually care enough to talk to me about it, rather than just shrugging your shoulders and moving on, right? And so it's those experiences that strengthen the name. I'll bet you when Apple, who knows how Steve Jobs came up with the name Apple? Anyone know? Yeah. He liked apples. Yeah, he had just come back from an apple farm. He was on what he called a fruitarian diet. He had just come back from Oregon from an apple farm, and he told, what's the guy's name? Wozniacki. He told him, he's like, Apple, I love apples. It's a fun name. I like apples. We should call ourselves Apple. The Beatles brand was called Apple Records, so they got sued over it, right? But over time, I'll bet you a lot of people are like, that is the dumbest name I've ever heard. You guys don't sell apples. You don't have an apple farm, right? It's not so much about what the name is, but it's about what it represents. And it's representing all the experiences that people have with Apple, and the rest is history as far as that goes, right? So remember that your name and your logo as well, that's just a very small part of your brand. So if you're thinking about should we change our name? Should we change our brand? Maybe. But that goes back to what I talked about with that conceptual framework. You need to understand your core identity, really understand who you are, why you exist, and that will help inform, does it make sense? You also need to know your audience and listen to them and find out, what are the strengths and weaknesses of our brand, of our name, of our logo, and that will help you figure out whether to change it or not. To speak really quickly, just briefly on and this is probably an area where I diverge a little bit with frameworks. Actually, there's a lot I love about frameworks. There's some things I don't agree with. All right, now we're getting into it, right? If you have the name senior in your name, don't get rid of it. It's fine. Yeah, if you use the word seniors in your stories, keep it. Seniors is a great word, actually, unless, and this is where you need to know your audience, unless it's not a good word to use, in which case you shouldn't be using it. So I would probably just say, you need to understand your audience, you need to understand yourself, and then you can figure out what's the right language to use, what's the right language not to use. I actually think seniors is a great word. I'm not a big fan of, and love your feedback on this, or anyone's feedback.
I'm going to jump in here, but go ahead.
I'm not a big fan of older adults and older people because older is relative, and therefore it's confusing, depending on who you talk to. I asked my son, he's 9 years old, I was like, hey, when you think of older people, who do you think of? He started talking about high schoolers, right? So for a 9-year-old, older for him meant high schoolers. And as you go on up the age group, you're going to get different answers, and that's confusing. And if you confuse your audience, you're going to lose them, right? So you need to speak with clarity. Seniors, there's generally a shared understanding about the word seniors and what it means and who it's referring to. Now, I agree, there can be negative connotations to that, but I'm a big fan of actually reclaiming words rather than just giving up on them, where I think that the word seniors, in the context, when we talk about frame, all the things that go into the frame, senior, the word, is just a part of that. But if you're telling great story within that frame that reorients the word senior in a positive way, I think it can actually be a good thing where you can begin to reclaim it and push back against some of that implicit bias and negative connotations and things like that. So that's my perspective kind of on words like seniors or the way we use language. But at the end of the day, you got to serve your audience, right? You got to understand them and use the language that best serves them. That was a bit of a ramble, but so I'll stop there.
Can I just add a really short counter rant.
Yeah.
So one of the things, no, and I've had to like explain this in 35 different workshops, and every time, kind of with the framework's talking point. And I have sort of come to actually exceed where frameworks is going on this. Senior does otherize, and I've seen it now that I've kind of like crossed that boundary into senior, having turned 65 this year. It is really sort of interesting how there is this sort of otherizing. So I much prefer and agree with frameworks recommendations to use neutral terms. If you want to be specific and your program is serving people age 50 plus or age 65 plus, simply describe who you're serving. There is an otherizing. I agree and now have seen a number of times how what the framework's research found about people being labeled senior, being less capable, et cetera, that there's a lot of validity to that. The other reason, and I know you were going to ask questions about what are takeaways for people who are, in the private markets, and I'm going to say among this is not frameworks research. I'm taking off any frameworks had, and I'm distancing myself from Marissa. There's a lot of other research that shows that members of my generation absolutely despise the term senior. And so when senior centers or programs that are targeting my generation, baby boomer, are trying to attract people and they've got kind of senior all over it, we're like, well, that's not mine and that's not for me. So there are probably market reasons not to do it. But I think to your point, Sean, that's also where it's important to understand your market. But right now, I land solidly on the either older adult or older person, or simply being descriptive about, if you're involved with the program, who this program targets, so we are not labeling or otherizing people simply based on age.
Thank you. And I'm so happy that you brought that up, because that was my final question. And I feel like that's also the elephant in the room a little bit. And I think this is kind of where I was hoping we would end up actually in our dialogue, which was tossing that around a little bit, because I think it's something, that's really where you start to get your hands dirty and you start to figure out, okay, well, what's going on here, So with that, that's the end of our dialogue. Thanks for sticking around. And if we have some time for any questions. If anybody has a question, feel free to, Carrie, will you grab the mic? And thanks.
Well, thank you all. And I was hoping you would talk about the linguistics. You said there was in the chart this morning something like, I don't know, many more linguistic people in your company. And so I was thinking about language and, with older people because that's who I work with. And I was thinking about even the term caregiving is really kind of beaten into the ground. And it's hard to, I work hard to try to come up with sort of natural language about things. Like, for instance, I think in our parents' generation, people who lived in what we used to call rest homes were called patients, and now even the word facility, I heard somebody say that's the F word. We can't talk about facilities, and anyway, it's just, I even when I go and visit an older person, I try to not use a clinical or medical term for the visit. I'll just say, I'm visiting, And so I just wondered if any of you, I guess, Marissa, your name is, if you've got some kind of great language suggestions for people who are professional visitors for older people.
So we did not test the word caregiver specifically. I would say in general, but I completely understand what you're saying, because there's a lot of research, particularly in psychology, but also sociology, about the power of labeling and the ways in which it can stigmatize people, but also the ways in which, as Sean was saying, I'm going to mess up the last part of your name, I'm sorry. Sean Loy was saying we can recapture words and subvert their negative meanings, which is a beautiful thing. It takes a lot of time to do. So if caregiver or facility or words like that really make people feel uncomfortable, I think trying alternate words and trying descriptors, right? Like something that's just more general than that one word would be what my recommendation is. But I think that speaks to the ways in which there is so much implicit bias against people who are aging, and also fear about getting old and about health that we continue to do research on and are trying to come up with better ways to kind of combat some of those negative connotations. I think that one thing to remember is that generally, not always, but generally, we don't have one communication with people, right? We have repeated opportunities to talk to people, maybe to you know, for people to be exposed to the things that we're communicating as an organization. And again, just thinking of every one of those as being an opportunity to reframe. And if something's not going well, trying something different. I wish I had real empirical evidence about caregiving, and maybe we'll get funding to test that one as well, because that's a really great question.
I'm sorry, I have the mug. Sorry, I'll give it to you after. I got it first. Question about your talking about individual storytelling. I do marketing and advertising for a continuum of care senior living community. And so, you know, for a long time, a tried and true way of marketing and promoting a community is about the testimonial and my story, and then trying to help other people see themselves in that. So, given what you were talking about, is that a more frowned upon way of doing things, or would you say a testimonial campaign could be part of a whole branding if it were around a unifying positive message?
I mean, and you guys might want to answer as well. I'll just say very quickly that I think yes. Again, I'm not against individual stories by any means. I think they are powerful. I think you see them as opportunities to widen the lens, and then use those testimonials as examples. I think one thing that I just want to say quickly, and we come up against this with a lot of topics we talk about, is that we are increasingly, I think, kind of across the board, relying on people who've gone through very difficult circumstances to tell their stories, and telling them they have to tell it for social good. And that puts a lot of pressure on people who have lived under difficult circumstances. That might not be the case every time. People might be telling a great story about how things have really gone great for them. But like that story I was telling you earlier about the woman tearing the paper, or we see this a lot in immigration or in sexual violence, you know, the pressure that we put on people to tell their story over and over again can be another form of trauma we're inflicting them on. And so that for me, that makes me feel a little uncomfortable. But go ahead.
And I just, so to the continuing care retirement community, so I mentioned that we did house parties, and one of the things our change agents are doing, they're just kind of showing up and talking about aging, ageism, and also some of these messages in different places. What has turned out, and one of our change agents is someone who works in a continuing care retirement community. One of the things she's reported that really resonated is that whole idea of older people gaining strength and momentum and wisdom and I often don't see that in marketing material for anything anywhere. It's sort of like, you know, here we are playing golf and but it doesn't have that meaning and purpose. So I am not a marketing professional, but if I were going to, I think testimonials are great for anything, but as opposed to individual story, how are you infusing how people want to see themselves as they get older? Encore.org and Stanford University did a great study that everybody should look at about the desire of people as they get older for more meaning and purpose. And I think that has a lot of implications for thinking about how we tell the stories about aging as well. And it leverages so nicely to me with the embracing the dynamic building, the momentum metaphor that Frameworks talks about.
What I'd say is, have you ever been to a art museum and you go up to a painting and you see it, and then you like walk up really close and you start looking at it, and you like back up and you like kind of get the wide view, like those are both really valuable parts of experiencing the fullness of that painting. And so I think it's the same true with story, right? Like again, having those details, those individual testimonials are really powerful. Having that wide view is also very important. Finding ways to bring those together. So testimonials are great. However, I would say like, don't do testimonials just because you're like, oh, we should do testimonials, right? Like, well, why? Why do you do testimonials? Why are they powerful? And what are the powerful ones? And I think part of it goes back to, again, understanding the person reading that testimonial. It's like, can they see themselves in that story? And sometimes I'll acknowledge, like, some of the things I'm talking about might feel a little bit abstract, of like, how do we really drill down in practical ways? But there's just truth to, you know, like when we read testimonials, the ones that really resonate with us, it's not because they're so amazing, it's because we can see ourselves in that. And so I think testimonials are a really powerful way to tell that overall story. Yeah.
Can you speak to the challenge of trying to tell a story to such a broad age spectrum? Because we serve starting at 55, and if we're saying that's an older adult, I'm a year away from that. I don't feel like an older adult. I'm still out at the gym and doing all my stuff. And I think a lot of people don't identify as an older adult until they're in the 60s, if I may generalize, but yet that's who we say we serve. So can you speak to that challenge of appealing to that 2-generation span?
So I just want to say a couple of things. One, what I've found most useful in the people who have been kind of trying to reframe and change the narrative is to be descriptive about what you're doing in terms of age, and not I mean, the essence of ageism is making judgments or stereotypes, right, about people based on the number that happens to be their age. And that's what we're trying to move away from in changing the narrative. So I think saying, you know, we have these kind of programs for people age 55 plus, and we do this for people who are age, you know, 70 plus with these characteristics or whatever, but being really descriptive about what you do. In terms of appeal, I think it's no different than, in a way, any other age group. When you think about it, you know, the lifespan of 55 to 80, you wouldn't in any way talk about in one set of language for people who are between the ages of 20 and 50. And yet somehow once people hit 50, it's like you're all older. So I think it's just, I think it goes back to what you were saying, Sean, about being really careful and knowing who you're talking to, and that they're not all getting one message. You know, there were probably funding reasons, legislative reasons why you serve different populations with different age groups, because those are embedded in legislation. But it doesn't mean that in your messaging to them that there has to be just kind of the one message, whether you call it senior, older adult, older person. I think being, to me, when you're serving a large, over a large lifespan, being descriptive in terms of age or any other characteristics has been really helpful.
And I would just add, it is a really hard nut to crack. It is a challenge. And so one thing that you can consider doing as you're thinking about, okay, how do I tell this story to these different age groups is again, drilling down and figuring out what's just the human element to it. What's something that's just a very human, like an example is like, right, like we all need to eat food, right? And so that's a fundamental human need, and there's a million restaurants out there. How do we decide which ones to go to, right? You can pick, right? We have our different reasons why we might pick one, but it's a fundamental human need, and it's the restaurant that can communicate things that appeal to something that's very fundamentally human that goes along with the need to eat food that might cause them to go there instead of somewhere else, even if the food's not as good. But it's trying to drill down into that and say, look, whether you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, we all feel this as human beings. And so if you can find some of those and begin to infuse that into your stories, that can be helpful to kind of bridge some of those gaps. But again, it's not easy because some things are very specific. You can't they're specific to seniors. Right? And so
because you're sitting right here, I want 20. Okay.
So I know that's not very helpful to affirm that it is hard, but
Right.
it's worth really kind of digging into the meat of that and kind of wrestling with that challenge.
I've got to wrap. So that's it. Thank you so much, Marissa Gerstein-Pinot, Janine Vanderberg, and Shunloi Fong. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. If anyone is interested in signing up for the mailing list, being on a mailing list to receive notices of workshop, resources, or anything else, I have little cards here that you can pick up and just check mark. Just put your name, email, address, check mark. It is free. Because Next 50 Initiative and Rose Community Foundation, if you come to one of our public workshops, if we go to your organization and customize something for you, there's a fee schedule.
Huge.
Okay? All right. Going once, going twice. Yes, of course you want to sign up. Everybody wants a workshop. They're so fun. Okay, here you go. Here you go. Yeah, if you can.
Right.
And I'll stay around so you can get them back.
Sorry. No, be a mentor. Be a mentor, and you will become the hero. So I worked it back in there, right? See how I did that? Yeah. All right, thank you.
And I'll just stay here for a few minutes, so if anybody wants to
Emily's
sign up
getting
and
me
leave
too.
them with me. I do evaluation planning.
Okay.
So my job is full-time to run Changing the Narrative. And we have just decided to start doing these like one-page, maybe two-page data briefs.
You bet. You bet. It's a good one.
Focusing on one. Absolutely. Very important, right? Like one thing and developing a brief around it. And so I was just thinking about the one that I'm using as an example and how I can reframe it so that it's like starts broader, gets more narrow, and then goes back broader, and finds those inner things, which I can kind of do for it because I know because of what the topic is. But I'm wondering, like, if we were to be like, hey, what is the population that we're serving, right? Like, for these one-pagers, how do you put the audience as the hero in that? Like, how would that work in that framework? I guess is kind of.
Who's the audience?
And it depends on the one. Sometimes it's going to be general public. Sometimes it might be judges. Sometimes it'll be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. When you're talking about like a really broad audience, that makes it more challenging.
Yeah.
But I think that's all the more reason to like, as an example, like let's say you're creating something for just millennials, right? Yeah. You can drill down really deep to a very human thing, and that's the most powerful thing, and then apply across different things. But millennials also feel certain challenges in their age group that you can speak to that feels not just an external problem, but is internal. So when you have a broad audience,
email
the
me.
challenge is
Do
to
not call me
out,
because I'm always out in workshops like this all day. But email me.
Now, not knowing the kind of the full content of it, one thing that could be helpful is like even just do a brainstorming session with your team and say, what are our fundamental human needs, right? And just figure out like there's the easy ones, like we need food, we need drink, we need shelter, right? Things like that. But there's other ones that sometimes aren't quite so easy to identify.
Like families is a really big one.
Or
sign up.
There we need relationship, or we need status in our community, right? Like we all long for that. We want to have a place in our community.
Anybody else want?
We all want to be a part of something bigger.
There you go. There you go.
So there's these different pieces that if you kind of brainstorm and say, what's this list of things? And can we work any of that into
anybody else?
Yeah, it is.
I do.
So that might be a way to do it, because then if you can talk about that, it's like the problem
you make
that people face, then, or at least that's what all people want,
Sure.
then it contributes to all
fantastic.
of their own context.
Janine Vandenberg,
And then you can present the content
As the introducer, so here is the instructions.
Is that helpful?
And then makes me reconsider what I was.
I
love it. Let's chat. Okay, sounds good. All right. And so what I was saying is like this new role that I'm working in is reducing. Sorry, I'm going. Is reducing resources, right? And then also helping people get back into the communities. Thank you. But those don't really seem to get out.
These are question cards
Issues. Like I
Deb has asked to
like
put out
some
on the chairs in the audience. And so do you want to just kind of put them on every few chairs? And then part of Deb's, or it's part of Teresa's introduction, I think.
To reduce,
she'll mention
summarize it
available, and that people can hand them to you or to Teresa throughout the session.
I think
you can just sneak them up to Deb.
Part of it
That
is
will
we
help
don't know. Part of what we're trying to do in Colorado is harness the fact that there are people that are coming of age who do want to talk about this and do want to talk about it, which decreases public safety.
Yeah.
The danger, if we don't do
I'm just
something
saying off the top
deliberately
of my head
about it
without
and
knowing
wait
all the
for it to
details
happen
of it. But I think
organically,
the aspect
is
of
some
like
of the,
everyone wanting to have
some of the
like a valued
policy
place in the
proposals that are
community.
put out there are absolutely scary.
You know,
when
you
we
talking
think
about
about an
people
aging population. So the fact
reducing
that,
the
and I'm not trying to be overtly political,
resources
so
there
if you are
and helping them
put your hands over your ears. But no, right now, the fact
we all
that,
desire to
a week before the election,
we want to help those
a
people
political party feels
who
perfectly
are in our
comfortable
court system
saying, and if you re-elect us, we are going to cut Medicare and Social Security, which has been the same
so that
thing
might be
for so
a way
many
to
years for
tackle
so many people.
But
so I
let me just
don't. I
nuance
would
that a
love
little
the
bit to
part
say,
of me that is ever optimistic would love to make
the
the
example you're
assumption
giving
it
is
take
like
care
a
of
heart
itself.
right?
Yeah.
It's like
The
if you're
part
telling a
of
nice
me
narrative
that
story,
watches
like, oh,
politics
that's very
says,
easy to
we better
have
work
a
on it. And
but
so
when
work
like something that
messaging
is
is probably important.
informational,
And I feel that it's important
like how do you
not just
infuse
for,
something that's going to
so I'm
to
clearly
get something
smack in the middle of the baby
it's a
boomer
challenge.
generation.
But
I have
another
daughters.
thing that could be
I help
does. Because it also depends on what you
We know
want people
that
to
there's
do
this
with them.
fundamental aging, and it's
Like,
not
what's-
just of
is there a
America, it's
particular
around the
call to
world,
action
and so
that
we
you're
need to
asking them to do?
reword
Or is it just-
He gets to see
how our systems are working
Like
on
the-
stuff that we work together, and we don't have conversations about that. So part
And
of
it's
what
also
we
being
want
live
to do
more transparency,
is,
more like
have those
seeing what
conversations
it is
about
that
what
we
does
are
it
working
mean,
on.
and how do we,
really
how do we make sure,
Yeah.
We're recording.
as a
Yeah.
mother, I
So
always
you remember in
think
like the
about
story
my
structure,
Okay,
daughters,
so,
how like
that my
the
daughters
guide
have
gives a
a
plan of
really
action
good
call for
understanding.
them.
Testing,
Grow up
testing,
and
one,
Sometimes like
two.
there's a direct call to action.
Anyway.
In the business sense, you might
So,
lead them through the story. Now
it's
buy
just
our share,
your-
right? There can also be transitional
two
calls to action,
files?
and that might
One of those?
be where this. So
that is
you're
my
not
current-
asking
One,
them to
two,
do
test.
engagement with this. That's one piece of a broader story. And so
gotcha.
it might be something like everyone wants thriving healthy community, right? So it might be something like that. That people, when they read it, they're like, yeah, I do. And if you can make it personal,
Yeah, that's the clicker. So
Test, one, two.
I'm going to set this all up for you. So all you have
that
to
is
do,
kind of that common human thing that we all
Alt tab.
Testing, one, two.
Oh no, okay.
Test.
So Alt tab will switch between windows. If you hold down Alt, you press tab.
Okay,
Okay,
for like
so
spending
here's
more
your-
time talking.
Oh yeah, you bet. No, I love talking
It's
about this.
like-
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things I was trying to figure out was like,
Yeah.
and tasked with these one pagers and like, how do I make them?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
I'm supposed to still be relaying data.
yeah, no, and that's a hard one. I am not.
Testing, one, two, three, one,
I'm
two,
not a
three.
data guy.
Yeah.
I'm very much like.
I might have a technical question for you here. We've got an
So
embedded
those
video
people
and
who
a
can
slide.
take data and information and turn it into compelling narratives. Yeah. Here, I'll give you my card.
It says
So
media
feel free to shoot me an email
unavailable.
with questions.
I will.
We'll talk
Thank you.
about
I
it.
really
And
This is
the,
off the M drive?
Yeah.
And this is off your laptop? Okay, you'll need to embed the media in PowerPoint before you copy it over. Or you can put it
Yeah,
on
and I'm one of those
laptop
kinds of
here
people
and we
too.
can present from
So what I
yours.
can do is I can get it to Jacob,
If we are in the
and
country.
I'm not
Or does this
sure.
live
I'm not
online
sure the
somewhere?
process for disseminating. Let me give you my card. Shoot me an email.
you want me
If
to
you don't
pull
hear
up
it through
the website?
Jacob, shoot me an email. I'll get it to you. So, all right, you bet. You bet.
My name is Nadia.
What is it?
Nadia.
Nadia, it's a pleasure to meet
Then
you.
go on to the second
I have
slide.
several pets. So first
I understand, yeah.
First of all, I'm a guinea pig.
Control Alt. Page the click around on Windows.
Alt tab.
Mine is 4 slides.
But
Minute or two each.
I have my laptop out,
Oh,
and I'm GIS specialist.
Okay.
This is the one? Okay. So you can full screen it and press play. So,
be also Alt tab.
Well, story map.
The
Yes.
Windows.
yeah, yep. Circle talk. See the titles there? There's your age-well CT. Okay, and here's your background on the side. And all you need to do is press it from beginning for each of these, and it'll throw it up. You'll see it here. It'll be showing on the screen. And then this will forward and back for each of your slideshows.
So this data could be processed. This data could be.
Do you want to try the Alt tab? Just so
I have
test
my
drive.
title page and then 4.
So you hold down Alt, and then you can select.
Because I figured there was a
hold
lot
down.
more just in terms of.
Actually, keep holding it. Yeah.
And I tab around.
Yeah.
Got it.
One click.
Okay, so this is for my presentation.
Existing
This is for
Yes.
How do you go backwards on the tab?
You actually just cycle through.
I
It'll
cycle
just
through.
go
Okay,
all
got
the way
it.
around.
So this is the video.
Yeah, you know what? I don't. And you're absolutely right. Like the story in and of itself has value. So we don't want to diminish the power of the story by just turning in general data. But you also don't want to lose the power of
Am I gonna run it,
these
or-
stories can help us understand.
Senior Reach is part of the whole thing.
Oh, so I can just.
We just need to select it.
Project.
Yeah,
And I'm on
Okay,
that.
and whose is that?
that's the clicker.
Okay, so I
lot
need
on
to.
But this is, we can take this one. No, we don't.
Check.
That's my mouse. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, that one was off, so now it's on.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I'll do this, if you don't mind.
It was good to meet you, Janine. Okay,
You
we'll talk
are
again sometime.
USB drive E, I think, right? This one.
Let's do it. Let's talk.
Isolation.
All right.
environment, it is extremely dangerous
You have one too?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right.
That's why I was asking. So if it's
I'm gonna save this to the desktop. It's fine.
Oh,
I disagree from the standpoint.
Might start a few minutes late.
If you tell me your story, and I
You go,
take
Carrie.
that and I say, well, we
You're
have
safe
to
to the
turn
desktop
that
in case something happens. It's there.
What that does, I believe, is it disarms your story.
You just have one?
Your perspective.
How about if you
Now,
take,
you could tell me a story
well,
and
we
be
have
lying
to
to me,
free
trying
up
to
one more
manipulate me,
seat
you know,
here.
things like that, right? So absolutely, we see it all the time in the media and things like that.
I'm going to ask our friend.
For you,
Maybe the bottom one.
Oh, absolutely.
Panels.
Yeah, sorry.
for your own agenda.
So I do want to know what story you would tell about isolation.
About what?
About social isolation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, let's talk about that. For
Jennifer,
sure.
right?
J-E-N.
Are these out in the lobby?
There might be. Jennifer Flowers.
That's it, right? One end.
I saved
Okay.
it because it was caffeinated.
Okay, yeah, I know.
All
I
right,
brought
so
coffee.
you're on here.
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm gonna make sure that I save it to the desktop. Okay, so you're here too. And the way that it's selected is you hold down the Alt key, and you just tab to yours, and it has your name on it.
Okay, I can't help it.
Yep. Don't hit me. Okay. Let me give this back to you.
Jacob's on pretty clear here now.
Okay, is this yours, Carrie?
It is mine, thank you.
Okay. Did we get yours loaded up here? Do you know how to tab around?
No.
Huh. So it's
Hi, I'm
hold the tab down, and is this yours? Right there. And then this is.
And they will need to ask you.
Mine.
Do you know if yours is okay?
All right. I don't think I'm that good at it, but I will do it for you.
I met.
Okay.
Splendid. Yeah, it's all going to be fine now.
Okay. And then I just want to get my
I should look her up.
outline. And are we passing? I guess you and I are going to share this.
Young female internal medicine journal. Tell me her name.
I don't want to tip this over.
Yeah.
So you're introducing the topic, and then you're having us introduce ourselves.
We're going to introduce ourselves. Okay, then I'm going to do a short presentation, very overview level of social isolation, and then each of you gets roughly 5 to 7 minutes to talk about what you're working on right now, and then we're going to just start to
4
open it up to
PowerPoints.
general discussion.
And you basically hold down Alt and you tab between them.
Oh, okay.
So if somebody has an issue getting to their slide, this shows all of the windows that are open. And,
so there's 4 different people speaking and who have different slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a little complicated.
Okay.
But
So
that's
should
how
I
it
be
works.
up here when that happens?
Deb's gonna.
She's gonna be
Yeah,
managing
I
it,
showed
but
Deb
in
how to
case
do
she's
it,
having
but
trouble.
just in case she's got some backup.
Got a lot of confidence in my
Technical
skills. Okay.
Well, it's more that I have more in yours than in mine.
Yeah, okay. Got it.
So we're good. Not that I don't have confidence in you.
Now in that Boulder Medical. Starting to see patients. Yeah. Hello. Need to make my connection forward and back. You know who to refer to, and you know who
I'm not sure.
are, and so you'll learn who will be starting over. Wow.
I feel like need a bottle of tea too.
Jen?
Yeah. We promote it, like we should face it there in case they want to look at it as a promotion.
Start with that.
Donate to the AAA.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
Say,
So,
donate bucket.
hi. Hi. Hey, Doc. I'm Teresa. Hi. I'll introduce you. Yeah. When it's time for you to talk, just give. I'll set it up. Okay.
Jennifer.
Yeah, I know where it is.
Do you have a PowerPoint? Okay. Thanks. Mine was a quick put together.
It's okay.
we going to start? So, ready to start? Maybe. Okay, great. Hi. Welcome to the Understanding and Addressing Social Isolation session. My name is Teresa Diani. I'm the Healthy Aging Programs Manager at Boulder County Area Agency on Aging. This event would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. We are pleased to welcome Gabe Bodner, who will say a few words on behalf of Premier Mortgage Group, our Serving Older Consumers sponsor. Gabe.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So again, appreciate the opportunity to sponsor here with Premier Mortgage Group. Learned a heck of a lot in the last breakout session. I think I learned that I'm no longer a hero. I can no longer call older people seniors, and I've got to rework my entire story. But other than that, I'm well prepared for my 60 seconds of fame right now. But no, Premier Mortgage Group, again, thank you all for the opportunity. We've been in Boulder since 1991, serving not only the elder community and population, but all homeowners and home buyers. And we are here today out front talking about reverse mortgages for 62 plus years old. It's very specific in our age demographic that we're talking about now. So really thank you again. Reverse mortgages are not what they used to be. Please come talk to us. They are an awesome, awesome financial tool. We've learned a lot over the last couple years of what we've done wrong in the industry and how to correct that. And again, overall, it's really a financial tool to allow us to convert a portion of equity, which is effectively an illiquid asset, to usable tax-free cash. So again, awesome strategy. Thanks again, and I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Thank you, Gabe, and thank you, Premier Mortgage Group, for your generous support. So this session will function as a moderated dialogue. If you have questions during the session, please write them on one of the flashcards that we have placed on the chairs and hand them to either Juliet Kirshner or myself, and we will pass them on to Deb, the moderator. And we are pleased to welcome our speakers today. Deborah Skorvan, our moderator, is a director, creative director, and co-founder of Circle Talk, a program created to address the need to disrupt loneliness and isolation in the lives of older adults. Deborah has extensive experience in group dynamics and project management. For the last 30 years, she has served as executive director for the Society of Creative Aging, as well as in numerous management consultant roles for nonprofit organizations serving at-risk populations. Deborah's work focuses upon building capacity in people and pioneering new concepts that have powerful social impact. Dr. Elise Reinhardt, MD, specializes in geriatric internal medicine with Boulder Medical Center. She comes to Boulder from Tucson, Arizona, where she was the assistant professor of medicine at the University of Arizona Health Network Banner University Medical Center. She also served as medical director of the University of Arizona's Acute Care of the Elderly Unit. Dr. Reinhardt earned her MD from Drexel University and completed her residency at the University of Arizona. That's her all the way down there. Carrie Middleton, PhD, coordinates the Respite and Companion Volunteer Program for the Boulder County AAA. This program matches volunteer visitors with older adults to help alleviate isolation to these older adults, while also providing respite for family caregivers. Carrie is a board member of the National Association of Volunteer Programs in Local Government and presented on volunteerism and aging services at the 2018 National Association of Area Agencies on Aging Conference and Trade Show. And last but not least, Jennifer R. Fisher is a licensed clinical social worker with the Senior Reach program. She received her BA from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and her MSW from Yeshiva University in New York City, before relocating to Parkland, Florida for 25 years. Ms. Fisher began her career in mental health services as a clinician in a variety of sessions, including working in psychiatric settings, private practice, academia, and eventually leading up to a 15-year career with a large regional hospital system in its outpatient behavioral health clinic. She moved to Colorado in 2015 and joined the Senior Reach team as one of the 2 Boulder County clinicians. Jennifer received the Boulder County Elder Abuse Awareness and Prevention Award in 2017. Okay.
Thanks,
Okay,
Teresa.
Now we'll have Deborah come up.
Can I do it right from here?
Oh, okay.
Studio style. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I am so pleased to be with our panelists today. As you can see, all of us have varied backgrounds. We're going to be talking about social isolation from many different lenses. And I hope that we will be able to give you kind of big picture and small picture viewpoint of what's going on generally in the area of social isolation. So we just saved some time because you were going to self-introduce, and now you don't have to. I am the technician here on the computer, so you'll all bear with me. I'm not sure how that fell on me, but I'm going to do fine. The first thing that we're going to do is just kind of all be standing on the same ground around what we're talking about when we talk about social isolation. So, okay, here we go. So one of the things that goes on in this whole arena of social isolation is we tend to mix up terminology a little bit between loneliness and social isolation. So let's just, whoops. Let's see, we're on the wrong slide, so sorry. So we're gonna just make sure our languaging is the same as we get started today. So when we talk about loneliness, we're talking about more of a subjective feeling, or the unwelcome feeling, or lack of loss of companionship. People with loneliness might ask questions like, Does the quality and quantity of my social relationships actually match what I desire, what I'm looking for? Am I feeling connected to others? Or do I feel a sense of belonging? Not do I feel sense of belonging. So when we talk about social isolation, we're actually talking about something that's more objective and measurable. So what's the size of one's social network? We could look at what's the frequency of contact within that network. Is there availability of transportation? Is there the ability to take advantage of support resources? So we can look at some objective life situations, and then we can make an assessment about whether a person is in fact socially isolated. So the research is prolific. When I first engaged in this field in 2010, people looked at me like I had two heads when I would talk about social isolation amongst older adults. Since then, the research has come on fast and furiously. And so here's just a synthesis of some of the research, and I think that maybe when we hear from our panelists, we will actually hear more research that is field specific. So social isolation has been compared to the well-known dangers of smoking cigarettes and obesity. lacking social connections or frequently feeling lonely tend towards higher rates of morbidity, mortality, infection, and cognitive decline. Suicide is much more common among older adults. The highest rate of suicides in America is among people age range 45 to 64. Socially isolated or lonely people are more likely to have a heart attack or stroke compared to people with strong personal networks. Social isolation and loneliness have serious financial implications. Every month, Medicare spends approximately, this is mind-numbing to me, $134 million more, or $134 more for each socially isolated older adult than it would if the person were connected. But if you do the math, this really adds up. And you can back into some of those chronic medical and psychological conditions as the causal relationship between Medicare costs and social isolation. Now, this is just an overview, but I think that you can see that social isolation, as more data is collected on it, is going to become, in the next 20 or 30 years, a critical issue with all systems that are represented here at the table today. Causes of isolation. Kind of common sense, but yet stunning when you put them all together. Transportation is a key cause of social isolation. People retire from driving as they get older, and we lack affordable and accessible options for people. Therefore, they are just generally cut off from society. Poor physical and well-being, including untreated hearing loss, poor mobility, poor mental health, unrecognized and untreated. Life transitions, what I call social role changes. People lose spouses, people move to be closer to their children, they leave homes of a lifetime, they retire, they lose communities of a lifetime in workplaces. So life transitions really present a tremendous loss for people in general. Society societal barriers, including ageism, lack of engagement opportunities, which is something that's been a common theme throughout today, and lack of access to a social life. Communities are not designed well for people who lack, if you go back to the top of the list, transportation and have some health issues, aren't able to actually get out and access their communities because the communities simply aren't designed for those issues. Rural living is a tremendous problem, and marginalized groups, racial and ethnic minorities, and LGBT. So those are, according to the big AARP study that has recently been released, the top 5 causes of social isolation. So some of this, again, is common sense, but I think for today's discussion, it's important for us to be all operating from the same base. So what puts older adults at risk of social isolation? Who do you know that is living alone? Who do you know that has a small or non-existent social network, that infrequently or never participates in what we would call social activities? Who do you know that expresses feelings of loneliness? I can say that I know a few people. Anybody else? Yeah. I mean, we know those people. and what works. You know, in calling through a lot of the research, these top 5 recommendations kept coming up. And I'm going to say one thing about them before I go through them. That what strikes me about this list is that who doesn't need this, right? Who doesn't need these kinds of things? So the first is taking actions on the critical need for connectedness. This can be through expressed priorities within large systems that actually connection and structures for connection are actually a high priority and a high need in programs, program models, policies, and funding streams. One place that I've seen this actually manifest is in the UK, that has, in the last few years, developed an office, a ministry of loneliness. And they're looking at creating more of a ubiquitous approach to identifying people who are potentially socially isolated and lonely. And that includes having firemen go out and do routine checkups on seniors, sorry, not seniors, older adults and older people in their particular neighborhoods, and see just on a day-to-day basis how they're faring. Or there was the fire department, you know this, Carrie, was it ambulances? Ambulance drivers, when they're not actually working on emergencies, will also go out and do kind of spot checks. And the mailmen also have a list to kind of interact, when they interact with the customers in their mail area, they have a checklist of kind of what to look for. So I think that that is an incredibly creative way of using existing resources to identify people. Second on the list, having something, I'm going to add meaningful here. What works is having something meaningful to do. And this, again, gets back, everything kind of cycles back to what's our society valuing and providing for people as they age in society. And does society believe that meaningful activities and engagement is, in fact, an important element to build in? Having relationships, having a stake in the future, purpose-driven lifestyles, volunteer opportunities, and then having a sense of community, belonging to something, feeling included, feeling a part of society, small community, feeling a part of something bigger than yourself. So that's where we're going to launch our conversation today, is to get an understanding of how our panel experts and the systems that they're working in are looking at this issue of isolation and addressing it, and what's the lens that you're actually looking at isolation through. Good? Okay. Do you want me to forward this for you? Okay. Oh, okay. Hold on.
It says Carrie. It's right there.
Okay, thanks. All right, let me get you.
So I am profoundly grateful for Deb for queuing up the slide, because the last time I had to do this, it kind of wrecked everything. But we won't tell that story right now. And also thanks all of you for coming. As Deb had indicated, isolation is a really, really hot topic, as you probably all know, because you're here right now, kind of in this world. So again, I'm Carrie Middleton, and I work for the Boulder County AAA Area Agency on Aging, and I specifically coordinate the Respite and Companion Volunteer Program, which is the one program that we have that is intentionally designed to help address isolation and loneliness. I'll use those terms together a lot in older adults. So this is kind of briefly what we do. So as Teresa had mentioned in the introduction, we match volunteers one-on-one with older adults who are isolated or lonely, and the volunteers visit the person with whom they're matched for a couple of hours once a week. The volunteer's role is really social engagement, and so it's just about providing companionship. Where the older adult has a family caregiver, the volunteer also provides respite. But so far as the volunteer's interactions with the older adult goes, it is still really about social engagement. So we ask our volunteers to volunteer for at least 6 months. Many, I would say most, stay longer. So we've had volunteers in the program for as long as 8 years, in some cases matched with the very same person from the beginning. Older adults come to the program mostly because they're working with a partnering agency, so a local senior services, or they're working with a social worker. So as you can see, our model is really about one-on-one companionship and bringing companionship to the person in their home. So Deb kind of gave an overview. We saw lots and lots of different reasons why a person might be isolated. What I see very commonly in the Respite and Companion Program, or RCVP for short, are older adults who live alone, and in many cases, they also are experiencing some pretty significant health challenges or some pretty significant mobility challenges. And so RCVP brings social engagement to a person who otherwise is going to have a hard time getting out themselves to have that social engagement. So these are, I just wanted to give you a pictorial illustration of some of our volunteers because I think that the picture hopefully is an illustration of the friendship or very friendship-like relations that develops between the older adult and the volunteer. So these are a couple of people in our program. This was taken about a year ago on a field trip we had, and it was a really special day for me because you could really see, not just in this picture, but in the older adult interacting with other older adults who had gone on that field trip, all these pretty isolated people who were just having this really, really wonderful time. And that picture to me, you can see that happiness in her eyes. And so I think a strength of this program is it doesn't, well, I'll put it this way. A strength of this program is that at its best, it really helps a person foster a really high quality relationship. So it's about a relationship with depth. So it's not so much about expanding, except by one, a person's social connections. It's about providing a friend in many cases. And I hear from volunteers and older adults consistently say, we really become friends, or this person is really more like a family member to me. And I hear it again from both. So we did a program assessment, a little bit over a year ago now, and these are some of the quotations from older adults who are participating in the program. So you can see what they have to say and not just me telling you what they had to say. One of the things that strikes me, and this comes out in the third quotation on the slide, is it's not uncommon I hear from older adults or caregivers whose loved one is receiving the volunteer visitor that a nice thing about the program is that they're developing that close connection with someone who's not a family member. So since we do serve caregivers, a lot of times older adults in the program, they do have family support. And in some cases, and they're also high quality relationships, but I hear from caregivers, you know, maybe my mom needs to vent about me. This gives her a friend, this gives her someone to do that. So again, social engagement beyond close family connections. Again, even if those connections are really good ones within the family. Something else that I've just observed is having that social engagement in talking to caregivers, I think can also give an older adult a sense of a purpose and dignity. So I hear comments like, oh, she has her own friend now, or he's so excited when his volunteer comes over, he dresses up and he sits on the curb and he waits. And I think, just anecdotally, I think it can help people see themselves, going back to some of the ongoing conversations we've had today, not as, quote, just older people and not as old people who have health problems, but people who have friends, who have things to do, people to see, just as people, which I think is pretty powerful. Another pattern I see, dementia is very common in the program, and one thing that this program does is because dementia can be really isolating, and especially I see it in older adults with early onset or in the early stages, the program can provide a social connection such that the older adult and the caregiver don't have to explain or apologize, hey, this person has dementia, this is what this means, because they know the volunteer already knows that. They know the volunteer's already gone through some training. And so to me, this brings to mind sort of one way of addressing social isolation and loneliness is addressing that stigma with dementia, since that diagnosis can be so isolating. Caregiving also really, really isolating. So an unexpected benefit from the program that I hear from caregivers is that in some cases, the volunteer becomes a social connection for them too. It gives them a person to talk to about their loved one, about the challenges they're experiencing. And that wasn't sort of the purpose of the program, but it is consistently something that I hear from family caregivers. So again, one component of isolation or addressing it, giving support to older adults who are family caregivers. We see that a lot as well. And then I would say some of the gaps that I'm seeing or areas of need in RCVP, the Respite and Companion Program, are that because it does focus on that one-on-one relationship, what that can mean is that when they've developed that really strong relationship, if that volunteer has to leave the program, and most eventually do, sometimes that older adult is in the same position where they were. They're still lonely and they're still isolated until or if I can find another volunteer. So looking at sort of a bigger picture view that's going to have multiple approaches so that people aren't relying on a single person. As Deb alluded to, and I see this in RCVP as well, sometimes people become isolated or lonely because they have, say, unresolved health issues, mental health issues, or poor social skills, or they've burned a lot of bridges. And unless you give people tools to help overcome those things, or let's say they're late in life, they need to adapt to a disability, ideally, people could be given tools so that they can develop social connections on their own, even outside of a program like this. And then the last couple things I would say in terms of challenges or gaps that I see from my perspective through RCVP are one, just finding isolated older adults. Most of our program participants, as I mentioned, they're working with a social worker or another agency. But I'm sure there are lots of isolated people who aren't doing that, and so they're not coming to this program. And then also in that survey assessment of the program, only about half of all the participants in the program said that they've decided to join this program because they were bored or lonely. I think there's a real stigma to being isolated. There's a stigma to being lonely. And so there are some people, I think, who are never going to want a program like this unless, to allude to some of the conversations we've had earlier, we can frame it in a way that treats people like people and less like patients, say. So those are some of the things that I'm seeing that I'm excited to hear what everybody else has to say, and you guys too. How do we bring all these different approaches together to address this really pretty serious issue? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Fisher. I work for I'm a clinician with the Senior Reach program. And if those of you who don't know what Senior Reach is, it's a community program in Boulder County and many counties throughout the Denver metro area. The Senior Reach program I work for is through Mental Health Partners of Boulder County. We provide in-home counseling and some case management to anyone aged 60 and over throughout all of Boulder County. So that includes Longmont, Lafayette, Louisville, Boulder, Nederland, anything on the Peak to Peak, Allens Park. We will provide clinical counseling for anyone who is looking for short-term help getting through something that might be going on, and we've already talked about, there are lots of issues that are affecting older people, whether it's aging, relocation, changes in health, family issues, and we will go in. We offer short-term counseling, 10 to 12 sessions, and we are blessed and grateful that we have a grant through Boulder County that allows us to not charge anyone the services. So even though we will collect insurance information, we do not charge anyone, and that extra expense, if there is any, or if there is no insurance, is covered by the grant. So we have eliminated some of those barriers that might prevent people from seeking support, which would be transportation, privacy. They don't have to walk into an agency and say, hey, I need some help. And it is done in the comfort of their own home. And that really helps people break down the barrier of seeking support. So that's a little bit about the Senior Reach program. I am one of the clinicians. And I just kind of wanted to talk about what my lens from how it looks when I see people. And I put together a couple of scenarios, and I'm sure they're familiar to all of us, that we have seen people in these situations. So the first one, we call her Anne. She's 72 years old. She is widowed. She has children and recently relocated to Boulder County from another place. I picked Ohio because that's my home state. And she was encouraged to move, leave her home of all her years, 50, into a home. And of course, we know how costly it is to move to Boulder County. So she left a big home and moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Boulder County so she could be next to family. And I'm sure we have seen this scenario before. And she thought she would be spending a lot of time with her family. And as we know, life is life, and their families are busy too. And what happens? She doesn't see them as much as she thought she would. And she starts to feel lonely. And then she gets a little bit more fearful about driving around in this new town, realizing that she is not familiar with her surroundings. She doesn't have the friends that she had. She's left a community that she was raised in and raised her own family in, and now she becomes anxious and doesn't want to leave her home. So how many of us know someone who is in a similar situation, or have we heard of a neighbor, friend, or family member who has experienced this? This is a common thing that I see when I go in to meet somebody for the first time. This is what calls them to seek support. What do I do now? I don't know anything around where I am, I have no friends, and I have my family is busy. So I just wanted everyone to kind of get a chance that this is one possible person. Next, now we have a couple. Bill and Claire, been married a long time. They also were homeowners, and they've raised their children. Bill has been well educated, an engineer, and he was always the handyman at home, taking care of all the things that homes need. And at some point, he started to show signs of forgetfulness and confusion, and then was recently diagnosed with mild cognitive decline. And as we'll probably hear some more about, that is also one of those risk factors. When people become impaired to some level, it keeps them from wanting to engage. So now we have Bill, and he's relying on Claire. Claire has her own concerns. And now Claire has to take care of all the things that they were both doing together. And she has some of her own health issues. As we can see, she's had hip replacement, she has arthritis, and her physical capabilities are being limited as well. So what is happening? Claire feels guilty by going to continue to engage in her own social activities, feels guilty when she leaves him. Bill wants her to be around so he doesn't feel so lonely. And eventually they both become isolated and they both stay home. And they're both not engaged in anything other than each other. And as long as Bill continues to decline, it gets more and more difficult. And as Kate said, caregivers and care people, they have their own issues with social isolation as well. So that's another scenario that I may find myself going into a home and speaking to someone. And what is it that we're providing? Teaching them skills around how to manage social support and increase that network. Next person, we have Roberto. He's 82, and he has been really healthy, very active, lots of friends, not a lot of family, so his friends are his people. And he has been very active in his retirement. He rides bicycle, he does photography, and he's been very active in his faith. Over the past few months, he started to lose his vision and his hearing. And those things keep people and him from wanting to engage in their social activities, because how difficult it is to keep asking your friends or neighbors or peers, what, I didn't understand, or I can't see, so I can't really go play cards anymore, or worship in the way I wanted to. So he stopped doing those things. No longer is biking, no longer able to drive. So now his circle, his network is shrinking and shrinking, and gets depressed. Because from a very active man to a very inactive man, then the emotional comes out. Mental health, depression, sleeplessness, restlessness, and then health issues. So anyone know someone in that situation? Yeah, we probably all have. And then we have Dolly. She is 68 and lives in a small rural town, somewhere along the Peak to Peak probably, because we all know what those communities are very supportive of each other, and people moved up there for a reason. And they're going to stay there. But her home right now needs a lot of care, and she's been living in it a long time. And although she has a very, very strong social support system, as we do know that mountain communities, they take care of them, they take care of each other. And the problem is friends and people that she connected to and counted on are also having those same issues. And they're making decisions about whether they're staying in the mountains. And many of them have left to do the things that people do. Go to stay with family, find a place where there's more access to the things that older adults might need, excuse me. So her closest friend is now disabled and is making plans to move to a state outside of Colorado. Dolly has not been one to ask for help. In fact, she's been the one that's always offered the help. And now it's time for her to receive some support, and she's not going to ask for it. It will just become more and more difficult for her to pay her bills, and for her to drive the car, and for her to purchase food and make sure she has firewood for the winter. Eventually she'll become really fearful of losing her home because she can't keep up with all the needs it has, and her friendships are kind of declining, and now we have someone again. And the social isolation in the mountain communities is of particular concern because they have less access to the things that we saw listed above, which were transportation, healthcare, social activities, and resources. So those are the cases and similar scenarios to the folks that I see, and the things that we do are to help people process what's going on, link to community resources, learn new skills that might help them increase their social engagement, and find ways to make connections, because after all, I mean, it takes a village. So anyway, I just will pass this on, and I thank you for your time. We will continue this conversation. Sure. Do you need me
Okay, it's after 3 on a Friday afternoon. Let's just bring some energy back into the room, because we have an important presentation yet to come, a couple of them. So can everybody who can stand up for a minute and start to just rotate and shake your arms and shake them up and move your hips just for a second. We have like 40 minutes more to go. Right. Whatever you do is fine. Take a deep breath in. Let it out. Okay, now sit down. Let's push through this afternoon, because it's important.
Thanks.
Okay. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Elise Reinhardt, and we don't have a PowerPoint, so we're going to hear straight from you. Okay.
Talk from here, if that's okay. I don't have a PowerPoint. There we go. So I am Dr. Elise Reinhardt. I'm a geriatrician, which means I specialize in the care of older adults 65 and over. I love my job. I love what I do. Oh, okay.
Like an ice cream cone.
All right. A lot of what I was going to touch on has already been mentioned today, the risk factors for social isolation, both social risk factors like geographical isolation, death of a spouse, retirement, but there are a lot of physical risk factors too, some of which were mentioned. Hearing loss, vision impairment, decreased mobility, both urinary and fecal incontinence are big reasons that I see people don't want to go out or don't feel comfortable going far from home. And these are all medical issues that I do feel your physician can help you with or make suggestions to help with. So when I was asked to be a part of this panel, I was looking back on what I learned about social isolation in training, and really that's nothing. It's not in medical curriculums, at least when I trained, and even now I was looking at some updated medical literature, and there's not a lot about it. Doctors don't learn about social isolation formally in training and how to deal with it. So one of the questions I'm addressing is should you talk to your doctor about this, and why and how should you talk to your doctor about this? And are doctors equipped to help you with this? And the answer is maybe. I'm probably pretty well equipped to help with this problem. A lot of physicians are probably not, but the good news is that we have a lot of resources, some of them here today. I know at Boulder Medical Center there's a whole case management department that can help with everything from transportation to driver re-education and driver rehabilitation to getting home services in, to helping people age at home or remain in their home, to help with mental health services. So I'm really excited about that. Moving here, I did not have that in Arizona, those resources, and I feel like we have a lot of resources here in Boulder. So just coming here and learning about the resources has been very exciting. One of the things that I wanted to mention, if you or someone you know is thinking about bringing this up and wants to talk to somebody about it, you should talk to your doctor. Your doctor is trained to help you with all aspects, physical symptoms, mental, emotional, and it is appropriate to mention it to your physician. a way that you could do this that I would suggest, because it's a complex topic. And if you were coming in and this is your number one concern and this is what you want to talk about, and your physician thinks that you are here to follow up your high blood pressure, then you may not have the time or feel the opening or the opportunity to speak about this. And so I always suggest writing it out, sending an email, sending a letter ahead of the visit to let someone know this is how I'm feeling and I'd like to talk about it when I come to see you. I find that's a really good way to communicate. I always appreciate it. Then I know I'm prepared. Oh, they want to, Mr. So-and-so wants to talk about this. I'm going to make this visit about this and make sure I have time to have a conversation to delve into it. The reason that this is important for me as a physician is that there are a lot of negative health consequences from social isolation. And it actually has been shown to increase mortality, and that's death and bad outcomes. I think Deborah mentioned briefly it is increased with or associated with increased cardiovascular problems. It can lead to malnutrition. It can lead to unrecognized cognitive impairment. If you have someone who's really isolated and doesn't have a lot of social interaction, that person can really, really be declining and no one will notice. It is also associated with depression and anxiety, and so these are all reasons it's important to be identified. So with that, that's all I have to say for the moment.
Okay, last but not least is me. I am going to talk about a programmatic approach that we have been developing since 2011. And let's see, does this work? Okay. Which is called Circle Talk. And I am so happy. I have 5 Circle Talk leaders out in the audience. Raise your hand. Okay, 5 people that have been trained by us so far. So yay, thank you for showing up. Okay, so rather than tell you about the work we're doing in Circle Talk, it's what I call a felt experience. So I'm just going to show you a really quick video clip at the risk of self-aggrandizing. Okay, whoops, with no sound. Okay, who here knows about the sound on this? Huh? Is it? Okay, well, sound's already up, but I don't hear it. Is there okay, is there a mute on the computer keyboard? Hold on.
Let's see.
Okay.
I think we just, can I try something?
Yeah. One thing I did not ask. I'm looking to see. I've got it off mute. Shoot. It's trying to load. Who said that?
Let me see if I can find it.
Thank you. So we're not loaded yet?
I'll go see if I can find it there.
Okay. You know, it never fails. Okay. Okay, I'm going to try it. Okay, so I'm going to start talking. Circle Talk was developed to disrupt the pattern of isolation and loneliness in the lives of older adults by inviting them into meaningful conversations. So this is a programmatic group format approach. And what we've heard up until now has been more of a one-on-one, kind of a companionship model or one-on-one intervention. So we decided to try a group format. And I want to say that we're a training company. We train people to lead this program. And every time a leader facilitates a group, there is an opportunity for engaged, caring, and evocative person-to-person connection. We're going to forego the video for now. I'll show it to you at the end. Okay, so Circle Talk was developed to invite people into meaningful conversations. The model includes structured and participatory activities and conversations. If people came to our booth out there, you saw that we have a curriculum that leaders utilize to engage people to really what we call mine deeper conversations. People in the circle share personal stories so that they feel known, heard, and seen. Key to our model is to create a safe environment. That safety is really everything that if you can create a safe environment, you can maximize participation, and you can get people to really drop into self-disclosure, not on a therapeutic level, but on a person-to-person level. And sharing becomes easy, listening becomes deeper in the group. And there's comfort in the group around what we call welcoming the unwelcome. And I just want to unpack that phrase for a moment. Whenever you invite people to share, go into memory, you open up whatever you're going to open up with people. And a lot of times, memories can be very pleasant and memories can be painful. And the Circle Talk leader cannot always guarantee that people aren't going to go to a place of pain if they're recalling family holidays when they were a kid, for instance. So we train our leaders to be able to manage that moment by letting people know that they have witnesses and that their sharing is as important as everyone else's. And the group really becomes quite comfortable with that too. So that, to me, is one of the keys to creating safe spaces, that anything that's shared, first of all, is confidential, and second of all, is just part of people's story and narrative. Okay. Yeah, but Nat, can you wait just 3 minutes? Okay, thanks. Engagement tools. We use a couple of very specialized engagement tools. One is called the third thing, which is kind of like, you could think about it as a talking stick, but they are metaphorical objects that relate to that day's discussion. So if we're talking about if the main theme discussion that day is around life's teachers, we pass around an apple. Right in this photo, you see Helene looking in a mirror, which is our third thing, and the prompt for her is, in looking in this mirror, what relative or ancestor do you see in your face, and what did they teach you? Not stare at yourself, but take it to another level. So we use third things to support and go deeper into personal expression. And here's another example of a third thing where we ask circle members to bring in one cherished object from their apartment or home and tell us why that is part of the fabric of who they are in the world. Other engagement tools are poetry and stories. We usually enter into most conversations by reading a short story, vignette, or poem, and then the leader learns in a very prescriptive way to unpack that, to get people to kind of dissect a poem or analyze a story for what the universal meaning is. And then we go into, in every meeting, tell us a story about when you experienced joy or had to make a major life decision. So we go from the universal to the personal. So where is Circle Talk? We are all over the place, thank goodness. We are started in senior communities, independent and assisted living. We're now in memory care in some settings. We're in community senior centers, adult day programs, senior apartments, houses of faith, 55 plus apartments, any place where people can gather and could benefit from engagement, deeper level engagement than what I call light, trite, and polite. So, learn more, go to our website. And now I'm going to give you your felt experience, because our technician we didn't have sound.
Meantime, we're just building dramatic suspense. So.
Typically, we go into settings where there are what we call fixed audiences. So we just advertise. And do any of these work? Okay, thanks. Yes, we've trained people in senior ministries and people who work with seniors at synagogues.
It's wonderful. It's sharing. It's support.
It was just great. We've shed a few tears together and some laughs.
I can say what I want to say. I learned that I could be part of a group.
We enter as strangers and leave as friends.
This community here has meant a lot to me, and it's really enriched my life, my last chapter.
One hour. Yeah, we have groups that have been going for 3 years, 4 years. So we have about a year's worth of non-repeating curriculum, and then leaders mix and match after that and get creative. Let's see. So I think it's kind of interesting that we have the whole range of interventions here in terms of going into people's homes, that we have companion model, that we have a group format model, and then we have a medical model of of people coming actually to you. And one of the things that I wonder about is we're talking about the it of social isolation. How do people describe, how did they reach out if they don't want to identify as socially isolated? Like, I can't imagine I would go into a doctor's office and say I'm socially isolated. What are we looking for? What's the languaging?
So you're right, I've never had anybody come and say, I feel isolated. I probably have had people come in and say, I feel lonely, but it's not the first thing they want to talk about, and it's not the first thing out of their mouths, and usually it's an afterthought at the end, on the heels of a conversation about something else. So you're absolutely correct. Nobody has come to me and said that in that term. But I do think that I can pick up on when someone is feeling isolated and struggling and doesn't know what to do and is coming to me for help and suggestions. And I have been able to have conversations with people about things to try, ways to get around, ways to engage or reconnect with people that are already in their lives. And like I said here, there's a number of resources now that we have through BMC, and a lot of other health clinics have them too, I believe, that if I don't know what to do or I don't know what to say, I can say I do know somebody who might be able to help. Our social worker may be able to help and have some suggestions for you. You mean me as a physician can ask, or someone who knows this person
Can you
and is
repeat
concerned?
the question?
So she asked, what could anyone ask to elicit whether someone you know is feeling lonely or isolated? What if you think that you're dealing with a person who you feel is isolated, but if you ask them directly, they're going to say, no, I'm fine. What other questions or conversations can you have to kind of get to the root of that and maybe help that person open up? Let me think about that a minute. I'm gonna pass it to one of our other panelists.
I would simply ask, when was the last time you spoke to someone outside of this home? Or where does your family, do you have family? Do you have friends? What's your social connection to others? It may show up as other things. So it can show up as depression or anxiety or physical symptoms, and it's part of a whole conversation around, well, tell me about what your day looks like. Tell me about what your week looks like. What do you do to make yourself feel better when you're home? Who do you speak to? Who are your neighbors? When was the last time you got out of the house? Or so it really is part of a bigger conversation, because you're right, someone's not going to necessarily say, hey, I need some help, I'm socially isolated. They're going to say things around that, and we're going to have to pick through and identify for them what that might look like.
I think a good question that I use a lot is, what are you looking forward to? What's coming up in your future that you're looking forward to?
When I go and see my family physician, who coincidentally is part of the BMC network, the first thing I get is a little plastic physical well-being, all the way to do I
Mm-hmm.
Is that a commonly used? It seems to be at least the first step journey to diagnosing and perhaps giving advice to someone in that situation.
Sure. So there are a lot of screening tools, and actually Medicare has a number of mandatory screening tools that we use, depression screens, frailty screens. And so I think probably, I think you're talking about the whole review of systems, but also there are some questions specific to mood and feelings of hopelessness that are required, and someone would have to fill out or be asked to fill out at an appointment. So that is a really good way. If someone scored high on a depression screen in my office, that would be a good way for me to suspect that they are having other things that they really need to talk about other than maybe their physical problems.
I really see social isolation on a structural level. That we have, as you know, when I went down that list of some of the causes, some of the structural problems are just transportation, the way communities are designed. And certainly the other piece of it is, I'm going to try to say this in the nicest way, but as we all get older and things change for us and friends come and go and maybe people die in our lives, and we don't really have the skills that we had as a kid to make friends and engage with a social network. Would people agree with that? I think it's just harder as we get older. And I think social networks become a little more closed. And that to me is a structural problem.
Just a couple of comments. I agree, definitely. There are structural problems. Very car-centric culture. So, right, if you're not driving, definitely easier to become isolated. To go back to the question about what questions do you ask, I also wonder if you can ask something as simple as, hey, are you interested in, and then fill in the blank, you know, meeting with other people interested in whatever it might be, playing poker, flying model airplanes, Doctor Who, what does it matter? And the other thing I want to point out is not to downplay the importance of this issue, but we all know people who maybe their whole lives have not had a strong social connection and choose that. And so an intervention is only going to work, obviously, if the person wants to do that. And so I think part of it is tailoring interventions and checking what's going to work for them. Are they really interested? Yeah.
How do we find where your circle talks are? Because I find that going into a lot of like the multi-level care places, the independent living has the greatest sense of isolation, even though they're next door to 50 other people, because they have lost their community themselves. How do I get those folks to engage with Circle Talk? Because they are missing that engagement piece. And where do we even find where you are at? Right, where you're serving?
Out in the hallway, we have a table with our training dates and information about Circle Talk. I will say that in many communities, residential communities, the biggest problem we, not as much now as a few years ago, that we butt up against was that we would hear, we're already doing that, we're already doing social engagement, we do art classes, and we do field trips to restaurants and musical performances. And at Circle Talk, we call that parallel play. That there's a lot of parallel play that goes on, but there's not a lot of structured, engaged, interpersonal connectedness programming. So come and see me out at our table. Thank you.
I want to tag on to what Deb said and the question that you posed back in the room. Living in a senior residence does not make for a social connection. Just because someone lives in a large building with lots of other people in their same age group does not make them connect well or easily. It's almost like learning how to go back to college and living in a dormitory again. many of those people who are now living in older adult communities have not lived with others in a building structure like that, maybe ever, or if so, maybe in college back a while back. And in the years that they haven't been living with others, lots of skills have not been sharpened or at all, and maybe they never lived with other people. So it's not difficult to continue to be isolated in a large residence when those skills need to really be taught to people. It's not enough just to have a knitting class or a coloring class. It's important to teach people how to interact with each other, because they may never have been able to do that or never had the opportunities. And now as older adults, they're having to learn how to live next door to people, and that can be a complicated and challenging situation.
I just want to say one more thing about structural barriers. Right now we're talking to another nonprofit about partnering to partner with VIA around transportation, Meals on Wheels, to do outreach to people who may want social engagement. There's another partner, and then maybe the rec center, so that you have Meals on Wheels identifying people and letting them know that there's a social engagement program they can attend. VIA collaborates with the transportation, which is a big barrier, and then the rec center provides the space. And then we can do some engagement. You have to get people. This model is to get people to you rather than to go to them, because it doesn't seem sustainable to me that we're going out doing all one-on-one outreach and be able to address the problem really comprehensively.
And I would just say, I think it depends on the person. There are some people who are going to be happy with 2 or 3 social, very strong relationships their whole lives, and they're not ever going to want to do the group thing you described. And then there are others who that's going to work great. I think, I'm wondering if we had, some of you might have attended a mental health first aid training, and I'm wondering if we had sort of a general training for the layperson that was about social isolation and loneliness, and that just gave you the basics. Hey, gave people directions to go, whether that's a whole list of things ideally, so people can decide what works for them, whether that's circle talk or RCVP or whatever the case might be.
We have time for one more question. Anybody else? Yes.
And I think the other side of the benefit, in the case that Carrie mentioned, where going to the home is helpful, is in the case where it's a home caregiver. You're providing that dual function, that you're also providing that relief to the caregiver so that they have some time on their own. So in that model, getting my partner that I'm connected to, the person that I'm a companion to a circle talk doesn't work in this circumstance, so that this outreach program works appropriately for this situation. And I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just saying, as Carrie said, that there are different models are probably necessary for different situations.
Win-win. Lots of questions still out there about how to make this happen, but thank you, panelists. Any final comments that people want to make up here based on the...
One thing that I looked at when I was doing the research for this is looking at other communities and what they're doing, and some really innovative programs include doing intergenerational programming, linking older adults with children in a daycare or a preschool setting, and encouraging both groups to appreciate each other, and that has really shown to be successful. It's just something to put out there, because I think that those are really special programs.
I would say if you have comments on your cards or suggestions for how to approach this, I think all of us would love to see those, because it takes a village, as Deb said. It's a community issue. So if you want to hand those, if you have great ideas, please share them.
Great ideas, all are welcome. So thank you, Jennifer, Carrie, and Elise, for this afternoon discussion. And thank you all. Have a good day.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to remind you that at 4 o'clock we're going to get a closing speech from the wonderful Wade Buchanan from the office of Governor John Hickenlooper. Also, we do have BPD directing traffic outside, so when you do leave, it will be easy to leave this location. And if your name is Nancy Clark, please find me. That's it.
Oh, Nancy Clark. You know Nancy Clark? She was in that group we were, yes, but I don't see her in here.
Am I supposed to know Nancy Clark?
She is with the Hope Coalition.
Teresa would know Nancy Clark.
Yeah.
If she's with the Hope Coalition.
Yeah. So you have a monolingual person that you know.
Right.
At that meeting.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good.
I think so.
You know what though?
I'm hoping that. Hoping people don't. Yeah. Also, this for you. So you can do whatever you want. Just click away, we'll make sure this works.
What's the over-under on how many people are still
I'm hoping for 50 to 60. I hope not. I mean, we could actually. We can, circle the wagons, whatever.
Very nice. Good taste. Please take care of that.
I have a more personal question. I was just notified yesterday that someone I was supposed to long ago.
Boom. Will you just try that and see if it clicks through? Yep. Okay. All right. Awesome.
In which county?
Oh, it's me? Am I? Yeah, thanks. Are you? Okay, all right.
Where? Just standing up?
That's good. You had no sound with the video to begin with.
Did you get it coming through?
I think if you just sit right here, and if you look at me, then I can get that information.
Absolutely. Microphone in, out of the way.
How did it go?
It went quick.
Yeah,
You know,
goes
it
quick.
could have been a whole afternoon. We were actually just getting warmed up.
Yeah, you can ask him.
Okay, awesome.
Great. Yeah, he was thinking he would scroll. He's going to use the click, right?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sometimes those are tough cases because until that there is a event that may lead him to seek it, he doesn't have family that's willing to take care of those things. It will either be a law enforcement, somebody can call crisis, or adult protective and say and have a welfare check done and let them make the
Well, that's what we thought is adult protective services.
They would go out and make a call, a check and see, and if they felt that he was needing additional care or support or services, they would make that referral.
And what do
sometimes
they
that might be the best thing.
Who do they refer to?
Depends on what his needs are, and whether he is capacitated to make decisions for himself.
So I suggest a meeting on Friday with adult protective services.
You're always welcome to call Adult Protective Service anonymously and say, there's a senior who's at risk, and this is the information, and they will go out and make a call.
They will do it. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Thanks for sticking around for our closing keynote today. It's no surprise to most of us that many communities across Colorado and the United States are seeing an increase in people entering their encore years. With growing public and private attention on aging here in Colorado, what kinds of things are happening that could encourage a more age-friendly state? We are excited to welcome Wade Buchanan, Senior Advisor on Aging for the state of Colorado, as our closing keynote speaker. Wade is the first person to take on this role in Colorado and was appointed by Governor Hickenlooper earlier this year. The position, funded by a grant from Next 50 Initiative, is designed to help the state plan and coordinate a wide range of programs and issues affecting aging and older Coloradans.
Wade has over 30 years of experience in state government, public policy, and nonprofit leadership. He spent 15 years as a founding president and CEO of the Bell Policy Center. Before that, he held a variety of positions in the administration of former Governor Roy Romer, including policy director, chief speechwriter, director of the State Energy Office, and acting executive director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Wade is a fourth-generation Coloradan, a graduate of Colorado College, and holds a master's degree from Oxford University in England. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful Wade Buchanan.
Wow, I didn't realize I required 2 introductions. Thank you. Thank you. My bio says that I'm a 4th-generation Coloradan. I should say I'm the 4th generation of my family to live in Boulder. I was actually born at Boulder Community Hospital when it was up on Broadway and by North Boulder Park there. But I was telling Sherry that I haven't lived in Boulder for 40 years. I've lived in Colorado the rest of that time. But so it's nice to come back. And before I get started, I just want to acknowledge Sherry Leach again. This is her last month in a long and storied career on these issues, and most recently running the AAA. You've been very lucky in this community to have her leadership. I'm sure we'll find people to fill her shoes, but they're hard shoes to fill, hard pumps to fill. And Sherry, we'll miss you, and we hope you have just a wonderful retirement. And I'm sure we'll see you. So I am very aware that I am the last speaker today. I walked in the room this morning when you were speaking and couldn't find a seat in the 3. Try not to take this personally, but I did, when I was invited to do this, I like to talk. When I was a kid, I was told, you talk a lot. And I took that as, oh, I must be good at it. So I said immediately yes, and then I looked and I said, oh my goodness, I just agreed to speak at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon after people have spent 8 hours in these. So whoever the genius was, I'm looking over at Jacob, it's probably the same guy who scheduled the sleep thing right after lunch. Which I did attend, and it was wonderful. I actually stayed awake. It was very, very good. So this is a very interesting week. There's 2 big events going on. One we all share, and then one that is personal. So one is the election, and one is tomorrow is my mother's 90th birthday. She lives over in Lafayette in a place called Affinity, which is one of these 55 and older communities. So I come to you with a great deal of uncertainty around what the future holds on these issues, because elections do matter. But I also come to you with a great deal of gratitude for the life my mom has lived and our family has had together, and I think it's given me a good perspective for thinking about this conversation today. So I'm in a very thoughtful mood about these issues, and that's a very dangerous place for you to be, because when I get in these kind of moods, like I say, I tend to talk, and so I'm very glad there's no one in that chair. Someone ought to be in that chair with the sign that says 5 minutes. Yeah, not yet. I know better than that. But for your own safety, you should have someone there. I'm just warning you. Thank you, Jacob. I actually, so when that doesn't happen, I was best man in my cousin's wedding many, many years ago. And after the wedding, the wedding party took all the pictures, and it was all wonderful, but that delayed us getting to the reception, which is up at the Gold Hill Inn, which people here know the Gold Hill Inn. If you live in Boulder and haven't been to the Gold Hill Inn, you should put that on your list. It's a wonderful place. But we get up to the Gold Hill Inn about an hour after everybody else had gotten up there, and they had taken great advantage of that hour and the open bar. And so I start to make my toast as best man to the new couple. And I'm youngest of 4 boys, so one of my brothers, who is now a judge in Denver, I get about a sentence into the toast, and he goes, "Sum up." And then everybody else starts going, "Sum up," and I totally forgot what I was going to say, and so I just said, "What the hell, here's to the couple." And it was probably the best toast I ever made. But so when there isn't someone sitting in that chair, I teach people to say, when we get to this point, yell, "Sum up." So what I want to talk about is public policy. Isn't that great, 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon? And I want to talk about, I want to try to put perspective on everything we've been talking about today, and the fact that what we're engaged in here, the issue of aging, is a very profound and permanent social change. We have had older people forever, right? And I mean, you look in religious texts, and there's stories about folks who lived hundreds of years. So longevity is not a new idea, but so many of us living long is a new idea. And I want to, is my slide show up here? There we go. I hope I spelled everything right. Yeah. All right, so I want to talk about this change. And we're going to take a little bit of a historical text. We're going to talk about in the span of 100, 150 years, but I think it's important. So 47.3 years, that was life expectancy in Colorado at the beginning of the 20th century. That seems a long time ago, but let me tell you, the woman whose birthday we're celebrating tomorrow was born in 1928 and in a small town in Kansas called Gypsum, and it was the day, to give you perspective, on that same day, the Republican candidate for president, Herbert Hoover's train was passing through her little town, and the doctor was very upset with my grandmother that she had decided to go into labor, and because it was one of the big things that happened in that town that the presidential candidate was going through. My mother's heart has been beating every second since before Herbert Hoover was elected president. And it's going strong. It has a little pacemaker help now, but it's going strong. And so these numbers seem like a long time ago, but they're not. So 47.3 years life expectancy at birth in 1900 in Colorado, 82.8 years life expectancy projected in 2050. That's, for those who are math challenged, 74.1%. We've added, or we will have added, 35.5 years to our life expectancy. That is remarkable. And it really is one of the great accomplishments, I would argue, of the 20th century, one of the great unsung accomplishments. This is all about, public health and better medicine and safer workplaces and lowering infant mortality. Grand sweep of human history, I get a little dramatic here, gets us to 47 years. And in a century and a half, in a blink of an eye, we're approaching doubling that. That's extraordinary. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So here's a news flash. Longer lives result in more older people. Want me to pause so you can take that in? Write it down. Longer lives result in more older people. What this chart shows is it plots not just not the numbers of older people, but the percentage of us, the share of us who are 60 or older, starting in 1900 and going to 2050. And in the first, Mom was born right here. In the first, half of the 20th century, we went from under 5% of us being over 60 or over, to about 12.5%. And you plot a line, put a trend line on that, and it pretty closely predicts where we're going to end up, right? Little over predicts, but closely predicts. 25% by 2050, a quarter of us. Why do I do that break? Because I want this to be a boomerless presentation. I'm a boomer. I love my generation. But we spend too much time talking about this issue as though it's an issue of one generation, right? And that gets in the way of truly understanding what's going on. So having said that, I'll show you what we boomers did. So this is what we did. This is a whole bunch of young people pulling the curve down, right? It's like having a bunch of D students in your class. It just pulls the curve down. And then we get to retirement age, and boom. And everyone goes, holy crap, where'd this come from? Where'd this happen? This is where the terms like silver tsunami, which please never use, even though I just did. That's where this stuff, that kind of language comes from, because that's how it feels. It feels like it's coming out of nowhere, right? Where are these old people coming from? But this is what's actually happening. And if we, from a public policy point of view, don't treat it as though, with an understanding what's actually happening, we're going to misdiagnose the problem when we're not going to solve it. So let me show you a couple more charts. I'm a policy wonk. I love charts. I apologize for that. These are boomerless charts, almost. 1950, that's what we look like. These are birth to 19, 20 to 39, 40 to 59, and 60 and over, right? That's what we looked like in 1950. The very first boomer in that slide is 4 years old. Okay, so it's almost a boomer-free slide, right? Here's what we're going to look like in 2050. And the other benefit of talking about 2050 is that the very last boomer is 86 in that slide. So it's not quite boomer-free, but the point is, whatever the boomers cause, it happened after this and before that. And here's what we're left with, and this is the new normal, and this is what we need to be thinking about. We spend our time thinking that society is this society, and that's what our society is generally designed for. What our housing is designed for. It's what our transportation is designed for. It's what our thinking is designed for. Let me add one more piece to that. This is 80 and over. Now that's a lot of boomers, and that's 7%. So, and these are just for the math folks amongst you. These ones are really part of this. So don't, if you're adding it up and say, wait a sec, you're over 100%. Thanks, but I already knew that. So I'm going to leave that chart up because the rest of my conversation is all about this, the future we're heading toward, right? And what we do about it from public policy point of view. So what is public policy? It's public policy is how we identify and respond to the challenges we face as a society and how we do that collectively, right? So what do we perceive as challenges? What do we perceive as problems? How do we think we can solve them? We deal with public policy all the time. The other day, I heard people lamenting how little Medicaid reimburses for certain chores, certain jobs. Public policy. I've heard people say Medicaid reimburses us at such a low rate that the people we're paying with those Medicaid funds have to go be on Medicaid. Public policy. So public policy is how we express our values as a community through the structures of government, or how we don't do that. Sometimes public policy is to leave it alone. So our challenge in public policy is to figure out, so what kind of challenge is this? Is this something we should care about? Is this a problem? Is this a great new opportunity? Is it something we need to mitigate? Or is it something we should embrace and adapt for? Well, we've got to adapt to it because it's happening. But I would argue it's a very wonderful thing. We're living 35.5 years longer. That's really great. And it's time to think, I also think of it as, you know, it's not just, maybe it would be a bad thing if what we were doing was adding those 35.5 years to the end of life as we kind of understood it before. So we kind of get, quote unquote, old and frail at the same pace, and then we're that way for 35 more years. That's not what's happened, right? What really has happened is an elongation of life. So virtually every stage of life, and I said yesterday not childhood, but actually now that I think about it, childhood has gotten longer in the sense, if you take the historic view of things, it used to be you went out and mowed, you can tell where I come from. You go out and you were plowing the fields at a young age or in the mines at a young age. Today, that doesn't happen, at least in the industrial world, that much. And so childhood is elongated, adulthood is elongated, parenthood starts a lot later generally. Adulthood, workplace activities go longer. We've elongated our lives. And we've created this whole new part of life called retirement. When Social Security was passed in 1935, 36, the average length, so it said you retire at 65, right? And we'll pay for you to, and part of the purpose of it was the public policy. And the public policy impetus at that point was get a lot of these older folks out of the workplace because we have this thing called the Great Depression going on. We have a lot of unemployment. Can we find a way to free up some of those jobs so more people can come in? Not exactly, I mean, you know, it made sense at the time, but not what we kind of rely on it for now, right? But the average retirement, I'm told, was 2 years. So, kind of lost my train of thought. Doesn't that happen at 4 o'clock on a Friday? So the public policy challenges here, and the elongation, that's what I was talking about. We've got this whole new period of life called retirement, the golden years, right? Used to be when Social Security passed, before Social Security passed, unless you were wealthy, your option was work till you die in poverty, or live off your family, you know, sometimes it was all three of those things. So this whole concept of retirement is really a fairly new invention, and aren't we lucky to be living at the time where that's happened? So understanding these issues and understanding how we got here is important, and understanding that this is not a problem. Who would vote to go back to the old way? I'm a third the way through my presentation, and I'm 2/3 through my time, so I warned you about that one. So let me talk to you about, I think, what's that? With my talk? Yeah. What's the problem with the graph? Did you hear that? Did you hear that? Thank you. You just jumped me forward. Well, that's only if you assume all these people leave the workforce. And they don't stop paying taxes, first of all. And a lot of them don't want to leave the workforce. A lot of them can't leave the workforce right now. And Edict from on high said 65 and you got to be out of here. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that as we think about this and as we embrace these challenges, it's about embracing a new way of thinking. The keynote speaker this morning, who had a lot more people listening to her than I do, talked about we can't argue our way through this. We have to speak differently about it. And the only way you can speak differently about something is if you think differently about it. So I'm so pleased you asked that question, because you're absolutely right. If we try to deal with this with the same strategies we used in this, it ain't going to work, and we are in trouble. But what I'm saying is, if we lift up our heads, look around, try to understand the context we're in, try to embrace this new situation, and then say, what do we do about that? How do we adapt to that? How do we make this not just longer lives, but better lives and better for everybody? What do we do? So the way I think about it is I have it in a series of buckets. What's going on in the family, what's going on in communities, what's going on in the workplace, which you mentioned, and what's going on in state government and in our local communities as well. And with the very little time I have left, I'll just talk to you a little bit about some of those issues. So, and again, with the uncertainty of what's going to happen on Tuesday, some of this stuff, look, this is an important issue. Whoever's elected governor, who's ever in the legislature, they're going to be dealing with these issues. They're going to care about these issues. These are not Republican or Democratic issues. These are human issues, Colorado issues, but how we deal with them will have the lens of those folks on, and that's fine. So how we deal with this, we're not totally sure, but we're going to be dealing with them. And so here's what I think we ought to be dealing with in the family area. How are we preparing to be older? I heard someone at lunch say, and if you're in this room, I apologize for quoting you, I'm not aging, but my mother is. And you can figure that one out. But the point is, if we think these are issues that we only have to start thinking about when we get to a certain age, we got two strikes against us. 750,000 private sector employees in Colorado do not have access to workplace savings accounts for retirement. We know that's the best way for people to prepare for retirement, and we know when people want to retire, if they haven't saved, they either can't, or the quality of that retirement is going to be not what they were hoping for, and they're going to, at some point, potentially end up costing the system more. So, very important question. How do we create a situation where more people are saving for that situation? I heard a lot today about caregiving issues. I actually had to take a call from a friend while I was in the sleep thing. Woke me up from my nap. And she was talking about how her father was dealing with the first stages of dementia, and she didn't know where to turn. And I said, well, funny you should call, And I had some suggestions for her, but I told her, you're not alone. This is the story of our families now. How are we preparing for that? How are we providing respite? How are we reimbursing? How are we providing flexibility in workplaces? How are we understanding those challenges? Huge, huge issue. Guarding against fraud. I mean, how many people have gotten that call supposedly from the IRS? I have it saved on my phone because I think it's, now that I know what it is, I'm just going to start ignoring you. a special place in hell for the people who do that. But you know, if I'm looking at Jacob, how old are you? May I ask? What? 35. So if Jacob falls for that, he's got a while to kind of recoup. I mean, too bad. It sucks. But my mom falls for that. Her life is fundamentally changed, and her options are not that great. So how do we focus on that? How do we focus on helping families have those conversations that they don't want to have, that we all know need to happen before the crisis? How do we help people do that? Because if they do that, we know things are better. And if they don't do that, and it happens when the stuff is hitting the fan, you're not going to make a good decision. And it's going to be very, very painful. So what's happening in families? What's happening in workplaces? And you mentioned it. How are we preparing for the workforce that we need to serve the oldest of the old, who, you know, for whom, I mean, they're not all frail, but there's a correlation between that and frailty, and how, you know, it's going to be a massive increase in the number of folks we need to serve. We're paying those folks very little right now. Are we just going to decide to create a permanent underclass of home health care workers? Is that our policy decision? Or do we do something else about that? And oh, by the way, yes, I know that costs money. I mean, that's not a simple question. That's a huge question. What are we going to do about workplaces and ageism? We heard a lot about ageism today, that affect whether people 50 and over are able to find that next job. And to your question, we need to solve that problem, because we need a lot of those people to stay in the workplace, right? And then lastly, what do we do about communities? And we've heard a lot about the need for going upstream and making sure communities are age-friendly. And I'm thrilled that we've been able to create an initiative at the state called Lifelong Colorado that really is encouraging communities to take on this challenge. So people live in community. That is our natural place to be as human beings. And we only leave community when there are barriers that we can't get past. Barriers of mobility, or barriers of safety, or barriers of, you know, you can think of them, social isolation. We've had presentations on a lot of them today. Those barriers don't need to be there. And we need to shift our mentality from thinking the problem is my hip or my knee, to saying the problem is those stairs, right? Because there's nothing about having a bum knee, or not being able to move around as well, or other challenges that we've identified that say you are no longer able to be a productive member of this community. And so then we say you must go someplace else. And we've all talked about those problems that are crazy. So these are some of the issues we need to think about. Lifelong Colorado is looking at a challenging Colorado to have over 100 age-friendly communities in the next 5 years. Boulder's been doing some good stuff on that. We need other communities. We've got about 25 that are taking on that challenge now. Is this a good place to live? Is this a good place for people of all ages to stay and to be? I've got 1 minute. You don't have a 1 minute sign. We can deal with these challenges. If we don't, then this is a problem. But if we do, this is a wonderful new future for all of us. And I would say, as a last thought, I heard a phrase I only heard a few times today. I wish I heard more, and that was multi-generational. A huge part of the answer, especially at the community level, but also at the family level and in the workplace level, multi-generational solutions. The last session I said in, we talked about social isolation, and I was noticing how much people were talking about people losing friends of their own age and feeling more and more isolated. But we know that when you live in multi-generational communities, that dynamic looks very different, right? So I will stop almost mid-sentence because I know I'm at time. I'm so thrilled to have been invited. I so appreciate the time here. I am just baffled as to why you guys are still sitting here, because it is 4:30 on Friday, and but I appreciate that, and thank you for this time.
Thank you, Wade, and thanks everybody for coming to the conference. You can connect with us through allagewell.com, through our Boulder County Area Agency on Aging Facebook, and also we have Aging Well in Boulder County newsletter. Please turn in your badges before you leave, and it was great to see you. Thanks.
Drop the mic, yeah.
Drop that mic. I just want to give you that as a comment. Thank you, and good speech.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.